Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. This video is about the case of the Ipswich serial killer, also known as the Suffolk Strangler. This man successfully killed 5 women in 1 month, leaving investigators in a frantic search to find clues relating to the murder. Our love and respect goes out to all those who knew and loved the victims and all those affected by this case. The mysterious death started in 2006 in Ipswich, a town in Suffolk, England. It began on the 30th of October 2006 when Tanya Nicole suddenly disappeared. Tanya was 19 years old when she disappeared. She grew up on an estate in Ipswich, but at 16 years old Tanya left her family home where she lived with her mother Carrie, her father Jim and her younger brother. She decided to go and live in a hostel, and soon after she left she began using drugs such as heroin. She soon developed an addiction to these drugs and resorted to prostitution to fund her drug use. She worked as a sex worker in the red light district area of Ipswich. Her family had no idea that she was doing this. She lied to them and told them that she was working in a bar. On one particular day Tanya went to work at the red light district and she never returned at home. She disappeared and was never seen alive again. Her mother Carrie and her family became concerned when they didn't hear from her, and not long after she was reported as missing to the police. After some investigation the police discovered that Tanya was actually working in the red light district area of Ipswich and was there the night she went missing. The search for her started, but they didn't have any clue to hold on to. They had a look through her phone records and looked through CCTV footage in the area, but she wasn't spotted on any of them. The police later turned to the public and they launched an appeal with Tanya's mother Carrie in hopes that someone would come forward with information regarding Tanya's whereabouts, but no one seemed to really know anything. 2 weeks after Tanya disappeared the police were notified about the disappearance of another young woman who disappeared in a way very similar to Tanya. The victim, 25-year-old Gemma Adams, went missing on the 14th of November 2006. Gemma, like Tanya, also had an addiction to drugs which began about a year after she left school when she was 17 years old, and she also funded this addiction through sex work, a job that she had been doing for roughly 2 years. That's exactly what she had been doing on the 14th of November at the red light district. A while after she disappeared her boyfriend started to get concerned when Gemma just suddenly stopped replying to his text messages. He knew that Gemma always updated friends and family about her whereabouts, particularly when she was working the next day on November 15th. Gemma's partner still hadn't seen or heard from his girlfriend, so he decided to contact the police and report her as missing. This left the police with 2 cases of missing women in the 2 weeks. Both were working in the red light district area. Investigations stepped up and soon they were handing out leaflets and posters with the girls' faces on them, and they also began conducting road checks. They stopped motorists who were driving around the areas where Tanya and Gemma worked, and they were asking these motorists if they knew anything about the 2 women. They stopped over 500 cars and interviewed hundreds of people, but nothing brought the police any closer to finding out what happened to Tanya Nicole and Gemma Adams. On the 2nd of December 2006 one of the girls was found, but sadly she was found dead. The man who found her was Trevor Saunders. He was going along a river in the area known as Belelstead Brook. Trevor was just doing his job like always, checking it for water blockages. That morning when he spotted something in the river, at first he thought this object in the water was a mannequin, and so he decided to get into the water to fetch it since his job was to clear blockages. But it was then that he realized that it wasn't a mannequin but was actually the dead naked body of a female. Trevor immediately felt that this body in the water may have been that of one of the missing women because their cases had been all over the news, so he contacted the police and reported his discovery, and eventually the body was identified as being 25-year-old Gemma Adams. Forensics were called to the scene where Gemma's body was found, but they were concerned they weren't going to find anything in terms of forensic evidence because the running water would have washed away any evidence that was originally present on her remains. Gemma's body was decomposed by the time they had found it. She most likely had been lying in that stream since around the time that she went missing, even though there were no indications of sexual abuse on her body. She was discovered entirely naked. However, an autopsy was unable to ascertain the cause of death because of the state of decomposition. While they were unsure of Gemma Adams' cause of death, they were sure that she had been killed because of the way she was found. The police sent dive teams into freezing water to investigate Bielstedt after Gemma was found, and they kept searching the stream for more evidence even with the freezing temperatures, and just 6 days later they discovered another dead body less than 2 miles downstream of where Gemma's body was recovered, and this second body was eventually identified as being 19-year-old Tanya Nicole, who had disappeared over a month before. Unfortunately, Tanya had also been in that water for a number of weeks, so there was very little possibility that police would be able to gather any forensic evidence from her body. Tanya's cause of death was also unknown because of how decomposed her body was. The Suffolk police went through 16,000 hours worth of footage, and after looking through some footage from Burlington Road, which was in the red light district area, they found something. They went back to footage from the night before she disappeared, and in one of the videos Tanya is seen getting into a dark gold sedan before it takes off. She is not seen again after that. The video was the first concrete piece of evidence the police had in this case, but because of how unclear and grainy the film was, they were unable to determine the car's registration plate. Just a couple of days after the body of Tanya Nicole was discovered on December 10, 2006, the body of another young woman was found. This time the victim was 24-year-old Annalie Alderton. Not only was she a mother of one kid, but Annalie's autopsy revealed that she was actually pregnant when she was killed. She was 3 months pregnant with her second child. Annalie was also a prostitute and suffered from a heroin addiction just like Tanya and Gemma. Unlike the other two victims, her body was found on dry land in a woodland next to a school in Suffolk. She was naked when she was found, and from what the police found, it appeared like the killer intentionally positioned her like a cross with her two hands spread out and her legs together. This time a cause of death could be determined because the victim's body was found on dry land, and it was found that Annalie's cause of death was asphyxiation, so she had likely been strangled to death. The police tried to trace Annalie's steps from the night she was last seen, which was December 3rd. A witness said they saw Annalie getting on a train that evening, so they looked at the CCTV from that train and confirmed that Annalie was on it. She had boarded a train taking her to Ipswich because she had plans to work in Ipswich's red light district that night, but that was the last footage ever seen of her. The police were now faced with a third murder, and these 3 bodies were found within 1 week, and although they couldn't be sure that all 3 cases were linked, they were certain that there was a serial killer on the loose in Ipswich. The sex workers were told by police to stay off the streets and to keep away from the red light district until the case was solved, but quite a lot of them still continued because they had to make money. Days after Annalie Alderton's body was found, 2 more women from the Ipswich area were reported as missing, and these were 29-year-old Annette Nichols and 24-year-old Paula Kennel, who were also sex workers. Paula was one of the sex workers previously interviewed by the police about the disappearances of the first 2 women, Tanya and Gemma, and less than a week before she disappeared, Paula Kennel did an interview with local TV crew about the case. Soon after Paula was reported missing, her body was discovered In a wooded area not far from where Annalie Alderton's body was found, the police rushed straight to the area and also called in a helicopter to get a better view of the entire area from above. They wanted to see if they could get any other evidence. The helicopter team eventually spotted another body close to where they found the previous one. Annette Nichols, the other missing woman, was identified as the second body. After autopsy, it was found that Paula had died from compression to the neck and had been strangled to death. Annette's cause of death could not be determined. Once the bodies of Annette and Paula were found, the police made a public announcement saying they were searching for a serial killer and suspected all 5 killings had been carried out by the same individual. By this time, the case had been published nationwide and the killer was given the Suffolk Strangler nickname. There were a few people the police were looking into as suspects in this case, but there didn't seem to be any solid evidence connecting any of them to the killings. Later on, a man named Tom Stevens entered the scene. He worked in a supermarket and was 37 years old. He was detained and placed behind custody on December 18 after he was linked to the Suffolk serial killer investigation. Tom said in a press interview that he knew all 5 victims, which is why the police considered him a suspect who might be relevant to their investigation. He said that he didn't have any involvement in the case and that he wasn't the killer, but that he could have been the killer because he knew the victims and they trusted him. It was a really odd statement to make, so the police decided to arrest Tom Stevens and take him into custody. His behavior was odd, but they didn't have strong proof to connect him to the murders, so they were unable to prosecute him with anything at that point. In an attempt to connect Tom Stevens to the murders, the police looked for any forensic evidence they could. They felt he had to be the murderer if his DNA could be detected on the victims' bodies, so forensic tests were conducted on the women's bodies and scientists were actually able to retrieve very small amounts of DNA from the bodies of Annalie Alderton, Paula Kennel and Annette Nichols, who were the last 3 victims that were found in the woodland. The DNA recovered from 3 of the bodies was found to have come from the same person, so they believed it was the killer's DNA, and they had just enough of it to create a full DNA profile, so they finally had the breakthrough they had been waiting for. In this case, they had the killer's DNA. Interestingly, Tom Stevens, the detained suspect, did not fit the DNA profile, proving that he was not the Suffolk Strangler. After Tom was freed, the police entered the murderer's DNA profile into the National DNA Database and a match was discovered. The DNA profile belonged to a man by the name of Stephen Wright. He was a resident of Ipswich, living on London Road in the heart of the red light district, and was 48 years old at the time of the incident in 2006. However, he wasn't even on the police's radar. They never suspected he had any connection to the case. He was only convicted of 1 crime before, which was theft in 2001 when he took a small amount of money. He had never before been arrested for anything before that, but now he was the prime suspect in an investigation into serial killings, so it seemed a moment of greed from Steve Wright's past had caught up with him, bringing to an end one of the most spectacular killing sprees of modern times. While the murders were happening, police had flooded Ipswich's red light district. They had no idea the man they were hunting lived at the very center of it. Number 79, London Road. Stephen Wright was born Stephen Gerald James Wright on the 24th of April 1958 to his parents, Conrad and Patricia Wright. Stephen was one of 4 siblings. He had 2 younger sisters and an older brother, and the Wright family lived in the country of Norfolk in England. However, when Stephen was around 8 or 9 years old, his parents, Conrad and Patricia, got a divorce. Online sources claimed that Patricia left Conrad and the family because of his violent behavior toward her. Stephen later claimed to have grown up in an abusive and violent home, but his father, Conrad, disagrees and keeps on saying that Stephen's upbringing was quite normal. In 1974, Stephen left school and joined the merchant navy working as a chef on ferries. It was during this time that he gained a reputation as a ladies' man, often seen flirting with women. By 1978 he met Angela, married her, and had a child, but they divorced in 1987. That same year he married Diane, but this marriage was marked by abuse and violence, leading to their divorce in 1988. Stephen had worked in different roles, including as a truck driver, a forklift operator, and a cruise ship steward. He struggled with drinking and gambling, which contributed to the breakdown of his relationships. His mental health suffered and he attempted suicide due to mounting debt. He committed theft in 2001 in an attempt to pay off debt, which resulted in his apprehension and the addition of his DNA to the national database. His DNA was discovered to match the serial killer from Suffolk 5 years later, who had killed 3 victims. During the investigation, the police discovered that he was a regular customer at the red light district, and sex workers had a nickname for him because they were familiar with him. He had silver gray hair, which earned him the nickname Silverback Gorilla. He was also referred to as the Mondo Man because of the Ford Mondo he always drove. When Stephen was questioned by the police, he remained silent. He gave a no-comment response to every question asked during the first 8 hours of interrogation. With your DNA and the one before with your DNA both on their naked bodies, how can that be? You're corrupt. He had no interest in helping the investigators. They had his DNA on 3 of the victims' bodies, enough evidence to charge him with the murders. However, Stephen denied everything and pleaded not guilty, so the case had to go to trial. The trial was set for January 2008. The fact that Stephen's DNA was found on 3 of the dead suggested that he was the murderer, but the police realized they would need to keep searching for more evidence to connect him to the killings. They needed a stronger case against him, more evidence. They sent a team to forensically search Stephen's car, but it was difficult to find any evidence. His neighbors reported that they usually saw him obsessively clean the car on most nights. The forensic team, however, after much work, found fibers on one victim's body that matched fibers from Stephen's car. They also found tiny flecks of blood from another victim in his car. They checked his home and found blood on Stephen's jacket and gloves matching the victim's DNA profiles. The police re-examined CCTV footage from the Ipswich area. Now, knowing what Stephen's car looked like, it would be easier to spot evidence. They spotted Stephen's car in the area on the night 2 victims disappeared. They also identified the car Tanya Nicole got into on the night she went missing as Stephen. So far, the police had solid DNA forensic evidence linking Stephen to the murders of 3 victims found on dry land. However, they still needed more evidence for the other 2 victims. Scientists had to examine every debris caught in the victim's hair and found fibers from Stephen's clothing and car. This finally linked him to all 5 murders. Stephen's trial began in January 2008 when the prosecution presented all their evidence. Stephen claimed he had sex with the victims but denied murdering them, except for the first victim, whom he admitted to picking up, but claimed he didn't have sex with her due to her acne. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury turned down his story and declared him guilty of all 5 murders. Stephen Wright was sentenced to life in prison, with the judge recommending he should never be released. He remains in prison to this day at 62 years old. It was suggested that Stephen may have had more victims, but he was never successfully linked to other cases, until very recently, when he was also charged with the kidnap and murder of 17-year-old Victoria Hall in 1999. Additionally, he faces charges of the attempted kidnapping of a 22-year-old woman the previous night before Victoria was kidnapped. Victoria was last seen alive in the early hours of September 19, 1999 in High Road, Trimley, St. Mary, Suffolk. Her body was discovered in a ditch near a field approximately 25 miles away from where she was last seen. Suffolk police reported that she left her place on the evening of September 18, 1999 to Go with a friend to a nightclub in Bentil Felix. They remained there until about 1 a.m. on September 19, after which they parted ways near the Baum Grill on Undercliff Road West at around 2:20 a.m. It was just a few yards away from home at that point. When Victoria's parents woke up, they discovered she had not returned home and alerted the police. A missing person inquiry was opened, but 5 days later Victoria's body was found by a dog walker in a ditch beside fields on Creating Lane, Creating St. Peter. In September 2019, the police announced that the case was being fully reinvestigated by a new team of detectives. The Victoria Hall case was one that remained unsolved for the longest time, but after some more investigation, all evidence pointed to Stephen Wright as the one responsible for the murder. The Crime Prosecution Service authorized detectives to charge Steve Wright with the kidnap and murder of Victoria Hall. He was also charged in connection with this incident with the attempted kidnapping of another woman in September 1999. She was a 22-year-old woman who reported being approached and followed by a man between 3 a.m. and 4:00 a.m. on September 18, 1999 on High Road, East Felix. These are all extra charges that would be added to Stephen's previous charges. He has been locked up in custody since his previous sentence and was scheduled to appear again before Ipswich Magistrates Court on June 3. On the day of the court proceedings on June 3, Judge Levitt postponed the case until August 19 for an additional case management hearing, followed by a plea hearing on September 2. January 13 of next year has now been designated as the tentative trial date. Some investigators still presume that many more cases, if reinvestigated, might actually link to Stephen Wright. The Suffolk Strangler story 2. Now we're going to be taking a look at another terrible case with you. For 7 days in January 2006, Richmond, Virginia was terrorized by Ricky Jovan Gray and Ray Joseph Dandridge, who murdered at least 8 innocent people. At first their motive seemed to be robbery, but the brutality of the killings made it look like a more sinister motive. Now let's take a look at what happened. Richmond, the capital of Virginia, is one of the oldest cities in the United States, with history dating back to the 17th century. The James River flows through downtown Richmond, making the vibrant city seem even more beautiful. But some things happened in that town that are far from beautiful. On November 5, 2005, a passerby found the body of 35-year-old Trevor Terrell Gray in a shallow grave on Brookside Avenue in Washington, Pennsylvania. Now Trevor had married Ricky Jovan Gray, a 28-year-old ex-convict, about 6 months before. The two lived together in a house owned by Trevor's family. Ray Dandridge, Ricky's nephew, had moved in with them after getting out of prison on October 26, 2005, where he had served over 10 years for armed robbery. Trevor's parents said the couple often fought, and on the day her body was found, Ricky had visible scratch marks on his forearm. But the police didn't consider Gray or Dandridge suspects at the time. Trevor's mother, Mara Squires, believed the police thought Trevor died from a drug overdose and didn't investigate the case thoroughly, although her death was ruled suspicious. No homicide investigation was started. A week after Trevor's body was found, her parents kicked out Dandridge, who then moved to West Philadelphia with his father. On December 23, Gray left the Washington home to stay with his grandmother in Arlington, Virginia. Dandridge joined him on Christmas in 2005. On December 31, 2005, 26-year-old Ryan Carey was attacked in front of his parents' home on North 25th Street in Arlington. He later identified the attackers as Gray and Dandridge. According to the autopsy, Ryan suffered severe beating and stab wounds to his chest, neck and arms. The assault left him in a coma for 2 weeks and he permanently lost the use of his right arm. But there is more than that to the story. On New Year's Day 2006, musician Johnny Hott walked up to his friend Brian Harvey's home with his young daughter on his shoulders. Brian was an ex-bandmate, but the two kept in touch and stayed closed. The Harvey family lived in the Woodland Heights district, a historic neighborhood with tree-lined streets and views of the James River. Johnny was early for the chili party the Harveys were throwing to celebrate the new year. It was 1:40 p.m. and the party didn't start until 2:00. Knowing his friends wouldn't mind, Johnny walked through the front door, which had been left open. The house was ridiculously quiet, and as Johnny entered, he was greeted by a thick cloud of smoke. He ran to the kitchen thinking something might be on fire and called out for the Harveys. Unable to find the source of the smoke, he ran outside and yelled for a neighbor to call 911. Dozens of police officers and firefighters arrived soon after. Friends of the Harveys arriving for the party stood shocked as they watched the firefighters and first responders swarm the home. The fire department quickly extinguished the flames and began searching the house. One lieutenant noticed more heat coming from the basement door and ran down the stairs through thick smoke. At the bottom, he found a woman's body. Thinking she was suffering from smoke inhalation, he carried her to the front yard to perform CPR, but made a shocking discovery. Instead, there was a sock in her mouth. At first, responders thought she had tried to cover her mouth with a sock to filter the smoke, but they soon realized her hands and ankles were bound. The woman was 39-year-old Catherine Harvey. As the EMTs realized they couldn't save Catherine, the crew inside continued searching the basement for the rest of the Harvey family. They first found the body of 4-year-old Ruby Harvey, her ankles and hands bound with tape like her mother's. The firefighters stopped searching as they realized they were in an active crime scene, trying not to disturb it further. Police investigators and the medical examiner made it to the crime scene. In the middle of the debris, they found Brian Harvey, his limbs bound in a hog-tied position. Nearby lay 9-year-old Stella, also bound. They also found 2 hammers and 2 knives, as well as empty wine bottles that may have been used as accelerants. There were no signs of a break-in, but Johnny Hott mentioned the front door was open when he arrived and the side door was unlocked. Several items, including jewelry worn by the victims, were missing. Brian and Catherine's wedding bands had been ripped from their fingers. The medical examiner on the scene examined the bodies of the Harvey family. He noted that Catherine Harvey had sharp force injuries, including stab and incised wounds to her neck. The youngest daughter, Ruby, also had injuries on her throat. Brian was hit 6 times in the head and had 8 slices across his neck, resembling a sawing motion. Stella, like the rest of her family, had similar injuries. It was also discovered that Stella was still alive as the house burned. Her cause of death was listed as smoke inhalation and blunt force trauma to the head. Lawyers for the man convicted for his role in the brutal murders of 2 Richmond families on New Year's Day nearly a decade ago appeared before a 3-judge panel today as he tried to get his death sentence overturned. The entire family had suffered stab and incised wounds and were bound, beaten and bludgeoned. Richmond detective Lisa Beatles, who worked the case, described the scene she witnessed at the Harvey home. She said, "Firemen and police were supposed to be tough-skinned superheroes. I saw people that I knew for 20 years sitting on a fire truck with tears running down their face." The Harveys were well known in their Woodland Heights neighborhood and the city of Richmond. The father, Brian Tabor Harvey, was born in Danville, Virginia, and was a talented musician with a teenage spirit. At 49 years old, he was a singer and guitarist in the band Energy Crisis and worked on computers for the Henrico County school system. His wife, Catherine Elizabeth Harvey, was born in Norfolk, Virginia, and partially owned World of Mirth, a local favorite children's store. The two got married on December 1, 1990, and had 2 daughters. 9-year-old Stella Ann, born in November 1996, and 4-year-old Ruby May, born in July 2001. The Harveys were artistic, athletic, and loving, and were deeply loved by their friends, family, and community. Johnny Hott, their friend and former bandmate, was the first to arrive at the scene and was initially a suspect. Due to his presence, there was no sign of forced entry, and the location of the Bodies confused the police. Friends and family revealed that the Harveys often spent time in the basement together, which suggested that the perpetrator might have been someone they knew. As we already mentioned, Johnny and Brian remained close despite their band's separation. They had even gone Christmas caroling together shortly before the murders. The lyrics of a song by their old band House of Freaks caught police attention as they seemed eerily similar to the murder scene, but it was later revealed that Brian had written the song and detectives cleared Johnny eventually. With Johnny cleared, police feared other suspects might still be at large. It wasn't until a 911 call came in that investigators made a solid breakthrough in the case. On January 6, 2006, the police got a call from a Chesterfield resident concerned about her daughter's friend, 21-year-old Ashley Baskerville. The caller suspected that Gray and Dandridge, who had stayed at her house and were Ashley's former and current boyfriends, were involved in the Harvey murders. The Tucker home was situated in a different part of Richmond, away from the upscale neighborhood of Woodland Heights where the Harvey family lived. When officers arrived at the Tucker residence, they were met with a familiar scene. Inside they found the bound, beaten, sliced and suffocated bodies of 21-year-old Ashley, her 47-year-old mother Mary, and her 55-year-old stepfather Percival. Percival was discovered in the living room, stabbed 5 times in the neck with duct tape covering his face from his chin to his nose. Mary's body was found in the master bedroom with 2 stab wounds to her neck and duct tape covering her face from her chin to her eyes. Ashley's body was located in her bedroom on the floor, her neck also sliced and duct tape covering her face from her chin to her nose. A shopping bag was taped around her head. All 3 members of the Baskerville Tucker family were found dead, gagged and bound with tape in their ransacked home. Percival and Mary had their throats slashed and all 3 suffocated due to duct tape wrapped around their heads. Ashley also had a plastic bag over her head secured with duct tape. Percival and Mary Tucker had been together for over 19 years, having met when Mary's daughter Ashley was just 2 years old. Percival, described as a quiet man, worked as a forklift driver but had a passion and talent for baking. Mary was a devoted churchgoer and active member of a missionary society and visited the elderly regularly. The Tuckers lived in the Swansboro neighborhood of Richmond, which is an area known for its high crime rate. Despite this, they had built a life there and were loved and admired by their friends. However, their daughter Ashley faced a lot of challenges from a young age. By the age of 10, Ashley was running with a dangerous crowd and her life got worse as she began experimenting with drugs and eventually selling them. By the age of 12, parents struggled to get to her and eventually they decided to involve the Virginia Department of Child Services. Ashley spent her teenage years in and out of shelters and treatment programs before being incarcerated just 2 months after her 18th birthday. Police immediately noticed the similarities between the victims at the Tucker home and those at the Harvey residence. Ryan Harvey, Catherine Harvey, who grew up in Virginia Beach, and their 2 young children in 2006. And we want to warn you, these details about their murders may be disturbing to you. Police found the family of 4 and their burning home on New Year's Day, bound, beaten and stabbed with their throats cut. Gray is also linked to the deaths of 4 other people in Richmond less than a week later, but he was never tried in that case. Bindings were used on all 7 victims and the medical examiner confirmed similarities in the stab wounds and slashes on the necks of Percy L. Mary and Ashley Tucker with those of Brian, Catherine, Stella and Ruby Harvey. But there were also solid differences. The neighborhoods where the homes were located were different, with the Tuckers living in a high crime area compared to the Harveys' upscale neighborhood. Additionally, the scene at the Tucker home appeared much messy, which was the sign of a more intense struggle. Another difference was the racial background of the families, with the Harveys being white and the Tuckers being black. Despite these differences, investigators managed to make a breakthrough. They found an extremely crucial item linking the 2 attacks: Brian Harvey's gold wedding ring was discovered on a chain around Ashley Baskerville's neck. Following this lead, police focused on finding the men seen with Ashley, Ricky Gray and Ray Dandridge. In addition to all this, Mary and Percy L. Tucker's Chevrolet Trailblazer was missing from their home when photos of Ricky Ray and the missing vehicle were spread across the internet. It eventually led to a tip from an old man named Roy Mason. Mason recounted a home invasion and robbery involving Ricky Gray, Ray Dandridge and Ashley Baskerville, who had forced their way into his home, initially pretending to ask for directions, then threatened him and his wife. During the robbery at Roy Mason's home, Ashley actively participated, taking a gaming console and going through belongings despite the pleas of Mr. Mason to spare him and his sick wife. Eventually the thieves showed mercy and left the couple unharmed. Leveraging Ashley's connection to the suspects, police convinced a female 911 caller to contact Ray Dandridge's phone, hoping to track their whereabouts. Ray answered the call and accidentally revealed their location, leading police to a home in Philadelphia, over 250 m away. Richmond police collaborated with Philadelphia detectives to surround the home, where they saw Percy L. and Mary Tucker's missing Trailblazer parked outside. On the morning of January 7, 2006, the SWAT team took action. Upon entering, Ray Dandridge attempted to flee through the back door but was quickly arrested. Meanwhile, Ricky Gray was discovered hiding in the basement behind a furnace, holding a power drill and violently resisting arrest. Concerned he might provoke a lethal confrontation, the SWAT team forced him without injury and took both him and his nephew. About an hour after their arrest, Dandridge confessed to killing the Tuckers and Ashley Baskerville. 12 hours later, Gray asked to speak with a detective and provided a detailed 3-page confession. He described using a kitchen knife and claw hammer to kill the Harveys and expressed remorse, saying, "I don't believe sorry is strong enough. None of this was necessary." In later confessions, Gray admitted to beating his wife Trevor to death while Dandridge held her down, took out the Tucker Baskerville family and attacked Ryan Carey. But who were these people? Ricky Javen Gray was born in 1977 in Arlington, Virginia. From a young age he was already labeled as hyperactive and disruptive in school. His difficult home life, marked by physical and verbal abuse from his father and molestation by his stepbrother, worsened his already insatiable state. Similarly, his nephew, Ray Joseph Dandridge, faced academic difficulties and was diagnosed with a learning disability. Though there were no reported instances of child abuse in his history, a forensic psychologist later described Ray as socially inept and easily influenced, often following Ricky's lead as he saw him as his role model. Despite the warnings from Ray's father to stay away from Ricky, the two spent a lot of time together, with Ricky usually taking the lead in their endeavors. In their late teens, both men found themselves in the middle of criminal activities, which led to their arrest in 1995 for a series of armed robberies in Northern Virginia and the D.C. area. While Ray was released after 3 years, he was shortly arrested again, this time on federal drug charges. Ray Dandridge, in exchange for a 5-year sentence reduction, helped investigators in solving another case. By January 2005, Ricky Gray was once again a free man. Around this time he met Trevor Terrell and the two got married. At first, Ricky tried to integrate into society after prison, even trying his hand at telemarketing and getting an electrician's license, but he struggled to adjust. Trevor's mother, Mara, noted that Ricky seemed constantly on edge, as if expecting an attack at any moment. Soon after their marriage, Trevor talked to her mother and said she was unhappy with Ricky and wanted a divorce. She wanted to kick Ricky out of their home. Around the same time, in October 2005, Ray Dandridge was released from prison for his federal drug charges. He immediately looked for his uncle Ricky in Pennsylvania. Despite not having seen each other since their arrest and trials, Ricky welcomed Ray into their home as he tried to get his life back on track, a decision that would have devastating consequences for Trevor and her family. In the years to come, around November 1st, 2005, Trevor went missing 5 days later. Trevor's body was found strangled and beaten next to a tree next to a car lot. As already mentioned, Ray left for Philadelphia to stay with his father while Ricky fled to Virginia to stay with his aunt. They wouldn't reunite until Christmas night, just a week before the Harvey murders, when Ray joined Ricky in Virginia once in custody for the Harvey and Baskerville Tucker murders. Ray said his uncle was the leader in their robbery schemes. Both men confessed to the crimes in a cold, matter-of-fact manner. They recounted how in early November 2005 Ricky and Trevor had a heated argument about their marriage. As the fight got worse, Ricky told Ree to restrain Trevor while he choked and beat her with a lead pipe. Ricky admitted to killing Trevor because he had grown tired of her after disposing of Trevor's body near the car lot. 2 months later, on New Year's Eve, Ricky and Ray targeted a man named Ryan Carey for robbery. Despite Ryan's compliance, they brutally attacked him, breaking off 2 knives in his body. Ryan survived but suffered severe injuries, including the loss of use of his right arm and extensive scarring. The next day, Ricky and Ray contacted Ray's pen pal from prison, a girl named Ashley Baskerville. Ashley, who had recently been released from prison herself in March of 2005, had flirted with Ree throughout their time in prison. However, upon meeting up with Ree and his uncle Ricky, she began a romantic relationship with Ricky instead. While walking around the Woodland Heights area of Richmond looking for a house to target, they came across the Harvey home. Meanwhile, Brian Harvey headed to a New Year's Eve event at the Doubletree Hotel where his band Energy Crisis had a show. Catherine and her daughter Ruby spent the night at home and had a quiet evening in, while Stella was at a New Year's Eve sleepover with a friend. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Brian returned home after playing a 4-hour set with his bandmates, looking forward to the party they had planned for New Year's Day. As they prepared for the party the next day, running items in and out of their home, the Harveys left their front door open sometime after 9:00 a.m. As Ricky, Ray and Ashley were walking through the neighborhood, they noticed the open door. They decided that this was the house they were going to rob. Ashley remained in the car as the watchman while Ricky and Ray entered the home carrying weapons. They assured Brian and Catherine that as long as they got what they wanted and everyone stayed calm, no one would get hurt. Yes, tragically, the Harveys cooperated with the men as they believed that if they complied they wouldn't be harmed. Ricky tied up Brian while Ray went upstairs to search for items to steal. However, a knock on the front door caught the robbers off guard when a friend arrived to drop off the Harveys' oldest daughter Stella from her New Year's Eve sleepover. Catherine, led by Ricky at knife point, went upstairs to get her daughter. The family friend noticed Catherine's odd behavior but didn't suspect anything serious. Catherine just mentioned she wasn't feeling well. Once Stella came, the men tied up Catherine and her daughters as well. Ricky and Ray then attacked the family using knives and hammers after stripping Brian and Catherine of their jewelry and taking items like laptops. They took a basket of freshly baked cookies from the kitchen. Upon returning to the basement, Ricky realized that the little girls were still alive. He then brutally bludgeoned them again with a hammer. Afterwards, Ricky and Ray used wine they found in the house as an accelerant and set the house on fire, spreading most of the wine in the basement where the Harveys' bodies were found. In their confessions, the men admitted to robbing Roy Mason and his wife 2 days later. Was it both of you that killed the Harvey family? Well, I hit the father and stuff with the hammer and he went hitting the mother and the kid, but he said that's not what killed him. He said suffocation killed him. He said, because we had we put socks in their mouths and put tape around them, and evidently the panic and stuff made them choke on the socks and things, so that's what actually killed him. They say so it wasn't the hammer blow. Didn't they have their throats slit though as well? Yeah, I think I did slit the father's throat first. Yeah, did the children's throats get split as well? No, not that I remember. So what was going through your mind the entire time that the killings were taking place of this couple and these two children. Harvey, get here, you know, all through the junk everybody, and like I said, it was more of us, it was also talking about our mausoleums, trying to hold them back and be quiet and skirmish, so I was just, you know, trying to get it through, you know. When I had to cut the guy's throat, you know, I realized I didn't do a good job, you know, like you said, because he had to come back through with the hammer and hit them with the hammer. Now I think about it, it was his throat. I did cut the father's throat, so it was sort of a daze, not wanting to be there, just going through the motions. Did it bother you at all watching the children die when it happened? I didn't see, I walked away. Did you ask him not to spare the children or anything? Yeah, I did, but he said he had to, and the girl, and then like I said, they were all just looking like these. You know what I mean, they knew more and stuff, so I just left them alone, you know, and tried to keep them calm and get them all out of the situation, but it wasn't going right. Then, you know, he came in and he had a reason, you know, then it seemed like a lot of a reason, the people seeing his face and stuff, so I couldn't argue with him and I just left them. At it. Following this robbery, Ashley suggested her own parents' home as the next target, specifically her stepfathers. She was unaware that Ricky and Ray were planning to kill her as well. They used Ashley as a prop in their robbery of the Tucker home and taped her hands and mouth before invading the home in the middle of the night and carrying out the brutal attack. Ricky Gay's trial commenced on August 17, 2006. Despite his confession, he pleaded not guilty. Attorneys did not contest any of the established information during the trial, and did not call any witnesses to the stand. Their lack of alternative strategies suggests they didn't pursue a diminished capacity or insanity defense throughout the proceedings. Gray showed no remorse or empathy, even as prosecutors described him as a cold-blooded killer. Prosecutors charged Gray with 5 counts of capital murder in the Harvey killings, including 1 charge for killing more than once in a 3-year period, 1 charge for committing more than 1 killing in a single act, 1 charge for killing and commission of a robbery, and 2 charges for killing a child under 14 years of age. It may seem odd that the Commonwealth first pursued convictions in both family murders separately, making sure Gray's fate was decided before moving on to Dandridge's trial. This strategic approach likely aimed to secure convictions against the ringleader Gray first. If Gray's first trial failed, the Commonwealth could then proceed with charges related to the Baskerville Tucker murders. The trials of Gray and Ray Dandridge were emotionally charged events in Gray's trial. Newspapers reported on the brutal killings of the Harvey family, with particular emphasis on the savage murders of 4-year-old Ruby and 9-year-old Stella. 1 juror was brought to tears and others were visibly shaken. Despite Gray's plea of not guilty, the jury took just 30 minutes to deliberate before returning a guilty verdict. Gray received a life sentence for the murders of Brian and Catherine Harvey and the death penalty for the killings of their daughters Stella and Ruby. Ray Dandridge's trial followed a month later. Like Gray, Dandridge also pleaded not guilty. The prosecutor described Dandridge's actions winding a roll of tape around a cardboard tube to illustrate how Dandridge wrapped the victims' faces. This graphic display caused distress to the family members of the Baskerville Tuckers, some of whom left the courtroom. DNA evidence consistent with Dandridge was also presented, and a recorded call he made from jail pinned him even more. Faced with the death penalty, Dandridge made a last-minute plea deal and pleaded guilty, receiving a life sentence in prison. Despite their confessions, neither Gray nor Dandridge were charged with the murder of Trevor Tyrell Gray. Her parents understandably still wanted justice for their daughter. Both men also pleaded guilty to the aggravated wounding of Ryan Carey and received an additional 25 years in prison. For many years, Dandridge was considered a suspect in the December 18, 2005 murder of Cheryl Warner, a resident of Culpeper County, Virginia. However, no charges were brought against him. Cheryl Warner, a legal secretary and mother of 3, was brutally killed in a manner similar to the Richmond spree killings, although a gun was used in her case. Despite Ricky Gray being indicted for her murder in 2008, the charges were dropped when investigators discovered that his cell phone was active in Pennsylvania at the time of the murder. This evidence raised doubts about his involvement. However, an inmate at Northern Neck Regional Jail claimed to have heard details of Cheryl's murder from Ashley Baskerville, which suggested that Ricky Gray was indeed involved. The inmate provided specific details about the crime that were not publicly known, such as the fenced front yard and the presence of a dog. According to the inmate's account, Ashley described how she and Ricky followed Cheryl home from a gas station, and Ricky then forced his way into her house pretending to need help with his broken down car. This testimony, although solid, was undermined by the cell phone evidence that placed Ricky in Pennsylvania at the time of the murder. Cheryl's murder remains unsolved. In 2017, a video was released showing Ricky Gray apologizing for the deaths of the Harvey family in a completely different demeanor than during his trial. In 2006, we're hearing from him for the first time, and he's apparently apologizing for the brutal murder of the Harvey family in Richmond. 11 years ago, that recording you just heard was released by Gray's attorneys. They argue his life should be spared, saying he only committed the murders because he was on drugs he started taking to numb the mental pain of being abused and sexually assaulted by family members when he was a child. A U.S. District Court judge has denied Gray's lawyer's request to delay the execution that's planned for next Wednesday, but the governor can still step in and stop it. This apology may offer some small comfort to the victims' loved ones, but cannot erase the trauma caused by Gray and Dandridge's crimes. In his final moments, Ricky Gray refused a last meal or words despite efforts by his attorneys to present mitigating factors such as childhood abuse and drug addiction. His appeals were ultimately denied, and he was executed by lethal injection on January 18, 2017. He is scheduled to die by lethal injection at 9 this evening at the Greensville Correctional Center. Gray's lawyers argue he should have been given leniency during that sentencing phase of his trial. They say his actions for the gruesome killings can be traced back to sexual abuse from his childhood. Gay Dandridge, on the other hand, is currently serving his life sentence in the Sussex State Prison. Story 3. Now we're going to be taking a look at another disturbing case with you. Josh Powell often claimed he was a devoted father, always putting his children first. "I love my sons more than anything. I put them in my family first," he said in an interview, but within months those words turned out to be completely in vain. Despite all his claims, Josh was not the loving husband he pretended to be. Struggling with uncontrollable spending, he had accumulated over $200,000 in debt and had grown increasingly possessive of his wife, even threatening to flee the country if she ever tried to leave him. This isn't a story of love, it's one of obsession, betrayal, and heartbreak. This is the story of Josh Powell. Our love and respect goes out to Susan Charlie Braden, all those who knew and loved the victims, and all those affected by this case. The story of Susan Cox and Josh Powell began like many others. Both were devout members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and met in November 2000 at a dinner party at Josh's apartment. The two were already classmates in a religion course. Their relationship progressed quickly and they married 6 months later at the Portland, Oregon temple. At the time, Josh was job hopping while Susan left her job as a cosmetologist to work as a broker at Wells Fargo to support Josh's dreams of becoming a real estate agent. Susan also got her realtor's license to help him in his career, as she truly believed in their future together. In 2005, the Powells welcomed their first son, Charlie, followed by their second son, Braden. 2 years later, Susan hoped their children would strengthen the family bond, but their marriage had already begun to crumble. Josh struggled to hold a steady job, which led to a bankruptcy filing in 2008, and this only made things worse. It eventually reached the point where the two started to hate each other, and this prompted Susan to document their struggles and journals and videotape their belongings as she feared a contentious divorce. It is 12:33 Mountain Time, covering all my bases, making sure that if something happens to me or my family or all of us, that our assets are documented. Hope everything works out and we're all happy and live happily ever after, as much as that's possible. She even feared for her safety, as she wrote, if she died it might not be an accident. Josh's upbringing was very dysfunctional. His parents, Stephen and Turkika Powell, had a tumultuous marriage that ended in divorce in 1992, according to Tarika. Stephen was very harsh towards Josh and he would verbally and physically abuse him. Josh even attempted suicide as a teenager. His parents' divorce involved accusations of mental unfitness, pornography, polygamy and witchcraft, with both parents making severe allegations against each other. Stephen, who had a deep-seated hate for the LDS Church and adopted extremist views, influenced his sons with his radical beliefs and contempt for women. Tarika's family described him as anti-church, anti-country, anti-authority, anti-morality, and accused him of teaching his sons to mock and insult their mother. This toxic environment left a lasting mark on Josh, who displayed alarming behaviors such as threatening his mother with a butcher knife and killing his sister's pet gerbil. The Powell children were deeply traumatized by their upbringing, as they constantly had to move between parents and grandparents all the time, and eventually Josh started to get violent. His father's influence, characterized by erratic and explosive behavior, left Josh with deep psychological scars. Jennifer Powell Graves, Josh's sister, recounted a chilling conversation with their father about men who stalk and kill their former lovers, and one day the unthinkable happened. As Christmas 2009 approached, the Powell marriage was at its lowest point, but Josh's wife Susan still believed her husband might have been changing for the better. On December 6, Susan attended church with Charlie and Braden at the 136th Ward, then walked home with a friend. That afternoon, neighbor Giovanna Owings visited Susan to help untangle yarn for a blanket. Susan was crocheting for Charlie. Josh offered Owings dinner but did not invite her children, claiming there wasn't enough food for everyone. As the women worked on the yarn, the boys helped Josh in the kitchen. A half-decorated Christmas tree stood in the living room with presents for the kids underneath. Susan had been waiting for Josh to bring the rest of the decorations from the garage. Although Josh was drifting from the church, Susan was increasingly involved and had saved money for tithing against Josh's wishes. She mentioned to Owings that they had been doing marriage counseling through the Josh had stopped participating and wasn't reading their assigned marriage book. Owings was nervous discussing the marriage while Josh was there, as Josh tended to dominate conversations during the visit. Susan felt cold and Josh brought her a blanket, impressing Owings with the gesture. When dinner was ready, Josh served Owings and Susan on the love seat and ate with the boys at the kitchen table. Owings noticed a change in Josh's behavior, finding him a bit more easygoing. Around 5 p.m. Susan decided to nap, likely due to exhaustion from a recent miscarriage and an ear infection. Owings left around 5:30 p.m. as Josh prepared the boys for sledding. Another neighbor saw Josh return with the boys around 8:30 p.m. At 12:30 a.m. Josh claimed he took the boys camping at Simpson Springs Campground, leaving Susan asleep at home. The weather was snowy and frigid with sub-zero temperatures that night. By the next morning, the Powell's daycare provider grew concerned when Charlie and Braden were not dropped off on schedule. She couldn't reach Josh or Susan and called Josh's mother and sister, who then called the police. Officers broke into the Powell home but found no one inside. Instead, they discovered 2 large fans blowing on a wet spot on the carpet. Josh finally answered his cell phone that evening and was told that the police were waiting for him. He was taken to the West Valley Police Station for questioning, where he nervously told a suspicious story about the camping trip. Little Charlie also mentioned the trip, but police found no Evidence at the recreation area due to fresh snow. Susan's personal items including her purse and cell phone were found in the house, indicating she did not leave at her own will on December 10. Josh and the boys, along with neighbors and friends, gathered at Westview Park for a candlelight vigil. They distributed flyers and prayed for Susan's safe return, with Josh shedding a few tears for the cameras, though many found his display fake. But there was another person who was as suspicious as Josh: Stephen Powell. Stephen Powell's disturbing obsession with his daughter-in-law Susan showed his view of women as objects of his desire, even as he served a prison sentence for voyeurism. Stephen's writings revealed his continued fixation on Susan. He described his overwhelming lust for her, detailing how he secretly filmed her and indulged in disturbing acts with her personal belongings. His writings displayed a lack of empathy or remorse, and he portrayed his actions as expressions of love rather than violations of Susan's privacy and dignity. Stephen's public statements, including an infamous ABC News interview where he claimed to have had sex with Susan, further underscored his lack of remorse or understanding of the gravity of his actions. The investigation into Susan's disappearance uncovered a chilling collection of Susan's personal items in Stephen's possession as little trophies. What makes it worse is that when Susan confided in Josh about it, Josh would defend his father, as he seemed okay with his father's behavior despite Josh and Susan's relocation to Utah. In an attempt to distance themselves from Stephen, his obsession persisted until the end. His final journal entries expressed his devastation at the thought of Susan's death, and he professed his so-called love for her. As the search for Susan intensified, her family reached out to the public through press conferences, hoping for any information that could help find her. Additionally, an anonymous donor offered a $10,000 reward. Josh's actions drew suspicion as police found out he had driven his rental car hundreds of miles and searched his family's minivan and home multiple times. In late December, Josh stopped cooperating with the police and decided to hire a lawyer instead. Why did he change his behavior all of a sudden? Police searched through Josh's media interviews, hoping to uncover any clues in his demeanor and tone. Many noticed his indifferent and suspicious attitude during these interviews, which raised doubts about his innocence even further. In January 2010, just a month after Susan disappeared, Josh packed up his belongings and prepared to move back to Washington State with his sons. He had the help of friends and neighbors to load a moving van and trailer, prompting skepticism about his intentions. Josh's credibility took another hit on February 26, 2010, when he and his father launched SusanPowell.org. This action sparked a feud between the Powell and Cox families, with the website being used more for the Powells to defend themselves than to find Susan. In December of the previous year, Josh accused Susan of having a double life and plotting to divorce him. He even linked her to another missing person case, that of Stephen Kuchar. Just when interest in Susan's case seemed to wane, a judge issued a warrant to search Josh's home in Puyallup, Washington, where he lived with his sons and father. This warrant followed Stephen Powell's disturbing interview with ABC News, where he made shocking claims about his relationship with Susan. But Josh Powell's biggest concern wasn't the police or the investigators, it was his own sons, Charlie and Braden. He hoped they were too young to understand or remember what happened to their mom, Susan. In Josh's version of events, he claimed Susan stayed home while he took the boys camping, but Charlie, the oldest, didn't support his dad's story. He told investigators they went camping with both their parents, but when it was time to leave, Mommy didn't come back from where the crystals grew. As a result, Charlie and Braden were taken from Josh's care and placed with Susan's parents. They became more vocal about what happened during that strange camping trip, with Charlie even drawing a picture showing Mommy in the trunk of the family minivan living with Susan's parents. Gave the boys a sense of safety, and they began to share more about what they remembered and Breer, the Cox Family's attorney noted that while the boys were still young, each time they spoke a clearer picture of that night. Emerged Josh realized his sons posed a serious threat to him despite being seen as a weird but decent father by many. He was unwilling to let his own children implicate him in their mother's disappearance, but the kids weren't the only ones who talked. An employee at a local Flying J gas station claimed she saw the Powell family on the night Susan disappeared. In the middle of a fierce winter storm, a minivan rolled into the gas station parking lot. Out stepped Josh, Susan, Charlie and Braden. The clerk, known only as Denise, found it strange to see them there at that hour in such bad weather. A man later recognized as Josh came in holding a toddler while chasing after another young boy, calling him Charlie. He was wearing a leather jacket and had a dark goatee. The woman, whom Denise later identified as Susan, looked well dressed for someone about to go camping. Denise noticed she had red eyes like she'd been crying. The couple bought rescue tape, crackers and licorice at the register. The man told a little boy waiting by the door, "Hang on a minute. Let me buy this and then we'll go camping." Denise found the whole situation odd. Who goes camping in the middle of the night, especially in a snowstorm and in a minivan? Shouldn't they have been in an RV or an SUV? They paid in cash, topped off the gas tank and then vanished. Weeks later, Denise recognized their faces on the news, but unfortunately there was no way to confirm her account as they left no paper trail and the gas station had already taped over its surveillance footage. On February 5, 2012, Charlie and Braden Powell were supposed to visit their dad Josh when their caseworker Elizabeth Griffinhill arrived at Josh's house. The boys got out of the car excitedly. They seemed happy to see their dad. According to Griffinhill, as they approached the house, Josh abruptly shut the door before Griffinhill could enter. She found his behavior strange, especially given his status as a suspect in Susan's disappearance. Griffinhill tried to get Josh to open the door, but he ignored her. From outside, she heard him saying something about a surprise for Charlie, followed by Braden crying. This worried Griffinhill because although Josh often surprised his sons, something felt off this time. As she stood there, Griffinhill noticed the smell of gasoline coming from the house. Panicked, she ran to her car to call 911. The dispatcher, Dave Lavick, didn't fully grasp the urgency of the situation. Despite Griffinhill's pleas, he asked for trivial details and didn't realize the seriousness until later. By the time Griffin's call was taken seriously, it was too late. An explosion engulfed the house, killing Josh, Charlie and Braden. It took around 22 minutes for help to arrive, but by then the tragedy had already occurred. Josh's decision to end his own life and the lives of his children wasn't a sudden impulse. It had been brewing for weeks, maybe even months. Before Charlie and Braden arrived on February 5, Josh gave away their toys and books. He also collected gallons of gasoline, preparing for what he had planned. Moments before his sons arrived, Josh sat at his computer and wrote farewell messages to loved ones explaining his decision. He expressed his inability to live without his boys and apologized for any hurt he had caused. But there was a dark side to Josh's actions. His plan to kill Charlie and Braden showed anger and bitterness. He didn't even make sure their suffering was minimized before setting the house on fire. Autopsies revealed that the boys died from carbon monoxide poisoning with chopping injuries as a secondary cause. Josh had attacked them with a hatchet and caused serious wounds before igniting the fire. The boys suffered unimaginable pain and fear in their last moments, betrayed by the one person they trusted the most. Initially, when Josh was told to take a polygraph test and a psychosexual evaluation, the reasons behind it weren't disclosed. However, after the tragic fire, it came to light that investigators had discovered disturbing images on his computer's hard drive, including incestuous drawings. Shockingly, these images weren't shared with all parties involved, including the Cox family's lawyer. If they had been aware, the Coxes could have taken steps to prevent Josh from seeing Charlie and Braden. Even more distressing was the Revelation that Josh had sexually abused his own sons before their deaths. Authors Greg Olson and Rebecca Morris uncovered evidence of this abuse based on interviews with family and friends. According to their findings during their time with Susan's parents, Charlie and Braden refused to wear pajamas, claiming Daddy said it was okay to sleep naked. Charlie even confided to Chuck that he and his brother slept in bed with Josh. Later, one of the brothers drew a troubling picture with the words "Don't play with me" next to an adult and a child. Additionally, when removed from Josh's custody, Braden was diagnosed with a fungal skin infection which can often result from sexual contact. Friends of Susan Powell suspected Josh of poisoning her in October 2009, just 2 months before her disappearance. Susan had been feeling nauseous and suspected she might be pregnant, which was later confirmed, but unfortunately she miscarried. According to her friend Amber Hardman, Josh prepared various organic concoctions for Susan to drink, including thick yogurt and fermented kaffir drinks. While Susan hoped to have another child, Josh didn't share her enthusiasm. Steve Powell, in an interview with the police, mentioned that Susan wanted another baby, but Josh was practicing safe sex, although there's no concrete evidence. Dave Colley, the host of the Cold podcast focusing on the Powell family, speculates that Josh may have poisoned Susan the day before she disappeared. Josh rarely cooked, and Susan felt unwell and needed to rest after eating, as recalled by Giovanna Owings. Colley's theory suggests that Josh might have crushed pills into the pancake batter and then used a tool to harm Susan before hiding her body and putting it in the minivan's trunk, but this theory contradicts Charlie's statements about Susan being with them on the camping trip, as well as the account from the Flying J employee who claimed to have seen the Powell family on the night of the camping trip. Josh Powell's reputation as a self-centered know-it-all who dominated conversations was well known among those who knew him. Former neighbor John Hollowell described the dynamic, saying, "We all love Susan and we tolerate Josh because he comes along. It's part of the package." That's how most people felt. She was always worrying about other people, where Josh was always the opposite. He was only ever concerned about himself, which made things sometimes a little difficult. As more details emerged about Josh's behavior, friends, family and neighbors shared their experiences with the man believed to be responsible for his wife's disappearance and the tragic deaths of his sons during Susan's labor. With their first son, Charlie, Josh prioritized backing up his computer over taking her to the hospital, making Susan's parents drive her instead. Even when he finally arrived at the hospital, he sat working on his laptop until he was told to be with his wife. Josh exerted tight control over the household to the point where Susan had to ask for permission to drive, and he would monitor their finances. He even went as far as forcing Susan to knit socks instead of buying new ones, and limited how much their children could eat. According to Susan's friend Rachel Marini, Josh once callously remarked about Charlie's meals, saying, "He gets one meal a day at daycare, that's all he needs. You're not wasting my food on him because he's just going to poop it out." This attitude led to Charlie being diagnosed with malnutrition at just a year old. Josh's control extended to Susan's mobility, as he banned her from having a cell phone and forced her to ride a bicycle to work. He even restricted her showers to save money, despite indulging in gambling at a local casino himself. What happened to the Powell family seemed to compound with the death of Josh's brother Michael Powell, who jumped to his death from a building in downtown Minneapolis in February 2013. Michael, who was considered the more stable member of the Powell family, had a promising future. He was pursuing a doctoral degree in cognitive science at the University of Minnesota, and had served in the U.S. Army before that. Despite his promising career and academic pursuits, Michael fiercely defended Josh and their father even against serious accusations. He firmly denied law enforcement's charges against his father and dismissed them as lies made up to damage the Powell family's reputation. Michael was also entangled in A legal battle with Chuck and Judy Cox over insurance policies worth $1.5 million which Josh had changed to list Michael as the primary beneficiary just months before the murder-suicide, but Michael's loyalty to Josh was filled with deceit and questionable actions. He repeatedly lied under oath about his involvement in Susan's disappearance, including hiding a Facebook account used to spy on search efforts for her body. Suspicion grew when it was discovered that Michael had his broken-down car towed to a salvage yard shortly after Susan went missing. Although forensic testing showed inconclusive results, the presence of human decomposition indicated by a sniffer dog raised eyebrows. Utah police suspected that Michael may have helped Josh in disposing of Susan's body but didn't have enough evidence to press charges. Michael's death only added to the sorrow and mystery surrounding the Powell family, leaving behind unresolved questions and pain. The deaths of Charlie and Braden Powell at the hands of their own father Josh Powell led to questions about the role of Washington's Department of Social and Health Services in allowing them access to their father. The Cox family. Susan Powell's parents filed a lawsuit against the DSHS, alleging negligence and seeking damages for the suffering endured by the boys. Initially dismissed in 2015, the lawsuit was revived by the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals in 2019, allowing it to proceed to trial. The trial, which began in February 2020, had disturbing details, including evidence of Susan's blood near a recently cleaned sofa and Josh's quick actions to withdraw her retirement account funds after her disappearance. The DSHS argued that prior to the murders there wasn't enough evidence to keep Josh away from his children completely, and cited strict guidelines and limitations on their authority, but the Coxes believed that the agency should have recognized the danger Josh posed to his children, especially given his status as the primary person of interest in Susan's disappearance. The decision to proceed to trial was based on concerns that DSHS allowed Josh too much control over the children's visitation and failed to heed warnings from police detectives, family members, and the boys' counselor about the potential danger they faced. To this day, Susan Powell's case remains unsolved. Stephen Powell was considered a person of interest but was never charged in connection with her disappearance. He died in 2018 while he was serving time for child pornography and voyeurism. In 2020, Washington State awarded Susan's parents $98 million for negligence related to the deaths of their grandchildren. Court is reconvened. Has the jury reached a verdict? Ma'am, it pleases the court, we have. Was the state of Washington negligent? Answer: yes. What do you find? Plain. Charles Powell's total amount of damages $57,500. 000. Story 4. Now we're going to be taking a look at another twisted case with you. Today's video is about the case of Ronald Gene Simmons. This man successfully killed 16 people in less than a month. When you hear of serial killings and mass murders, you almost always think of randomized killings, mass shootings, and maybe arson or a terrorist attack. But one story would have your insides in turmoil. Shortly before Christmas in 1987, Gene Simmons murdered 16 people within a 7-day period, with 14 of these being relatives. Our love and respect goes out to all those who knew and loved the victims and all those affected by this case. Born in Chicago, Illinois on the 15th of July 1940, Ronald Gene Simmons was welcomed into a somewhat troubled and dysfunctional family. Just less than 3 years after his birth, he would lose his dad, William Simmons, to a stroke. However, his mother didn't mourn for long, as she remarried. Within a year she would marry William D. Griffin, a civil engineer for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Over the next few years the family was transferred a couple of times across Arkansas. Little Ronald became troubled due to the frequent relocation, which made him act out at school by being a bully and causing trouble. He was a difficult student who unleashed his bitterness on his fellow students he was considered to be too troublesome to stay in school at age 16. His parents tried everything to discipline him, but it didn't work, so they sent him to military school as the final option. Ronald enjoyed military life so much that after he left school on September 15, 1957, he enlisted in the United States Navy. He was first stationed at Naval Station Breton in Washington, where he met Rebecca Becky LaBerry on July 9, 1960. He married Rebecca in New Mexico. After they got married, Ronald's domineering ways soon became obvious in their marriage, all because of his military experience. Ronald insisted on a clean and organized home and even tried controlling Becky's choices for clothes and hairstyles. He damaged her self-worth and increased the way she relied on him by gradually cutting her off from friends and family. Criticism and verbal harassment turned into means of dominating her. Over the following 18 years, the couple would have 7 children. Their relationship remained rocky even after Ronald Gene Simmons Jr., their first child, was born. After Ronald was released from the Navy in 1963 and enlisted in the U.S. Air Force. Around 2 years later, his aggressive behavior continued and got worse. Becky was afraid of the outside world as a single mother, so she stayed obedient even with Ronald's terrible behavior. Their home operated like a military base and no one was allowed to live freely. Ronald was unwilling to tolerate his kids' disobedience. He made the early decision that any child who disobeyed him would be punished. He always took it personally and would see it as a sign of disloyalty if a duty given to any child wasn't completed correctly. He imposed authority over everyone who lived under his roof. Ronald's favorite person was his daughter Sheila. He was with her most of his free time. The love he'd shown her was very noticeable. Only Sheila was given extra attention or privileges from him as a father. Ronald gathered the family into a room one day for a meeting. His goal was to make clear to them what his bond with Sheila was all about. Now 17 years old, she carried his child in her womb. He made the decision that she would carry the child to term and raise it alongside the family. He expected the rest of the family to accept his incestuous relationship with his daughter. Becky couldn't say anything because she had become so broken by Ronald's manipulation. However, Sheila's elder brother Ronald Jr., who was sick of the entire thing, reported Sheila's pregnancy to her school counselor. At first, Sheila denied that she was pregnant when her school authorities started to probe into her case, but she wasn't able to convince them. She was pressed for information about who the father was, and after nearly a month she broke down and confessed that her father got her pregnant in the course of his 20-year military tenure. Ronald received the Air Force Ribbon for Excellent Marksmanship, the Republic of Vietnam Gallantry Cross, and the Bronze Star Medal, but he withdrew from the Air Force from military duty on November 30, 1979 with the rank of Master Sergeant. However, on the 3rd of April 1981, the Department of Human Services in Cloudcraft, New Mexico, opened an investigation against Ronald after the report started flying around that he had fathered a child with his 17-year-old daughter. Fearing arrest, Ronald and his family left New Mexico in late 1981 and moved toward Arkansas in Licking County, and then in the summer of 1983 to Pope County, which is close to Dover, Arkansas, moving to a 13-acre plot of property 6.5 miles north of Dover. The family named the area Mockingbird Hill. A year later, with the victim and the perpetrator no longer in the picture, the examination into Ronald Gene Simmons and the incestuous rape of his daughter stopped. The case was abandoned. States were ill-prepared to prosecute criminals who had relocated to other states at that time. The house they moved to was made up of 2 larger older model homes that were connected together. Neither house had indoor plumbing or a phone. There were dozens of no trespassing signs posted along the path that led them to the house, perfect for a man who was eager to avoid attracting attention for having sex with his daughter. There was no plumbing in the house, so Ronald had his family dig 3 cesspits. Ronald had many menial jobs in the adjacent town of Russellville, Arkansas. It was extremely difficult for Ronald to find himself in a situation where he was being disregarded by co-workers, employers, and the general public. After being honored for his work as a military officer and given awards for it, he felt they no longer regarded him as superior. Even though he had risked his life for them, he was able to land a job in a legal company as a clerk. His employers acknowledged his discipline and strong work ethic. Everything was going right until he made some rude sexual advances to a female employee. After she informed management of this, he was fired right away. Ronald always believed he had a right to women's attention and sexual reciprocity, treating them like objects he could use. Once more Ronald found employment, this time with Woodline Motor Freight Company. He decided to be purely platonic and professional in his dealings with female co-workers. This time he still held a little hatred for women though, and didn't like civilian rule. All this made it even more disgusting to him that he had a female, Joyce Elaine Butts, as his boss. Ronald was really rude to Joyce and never followed any of her rules or instructions. All this hostile behavior towards his boss caused him to be fired again. It hadn't occurred to Ronald that getting fired had anything to do with his unprofessional conduct and insubordination. The way he saw it, the women of Arkansas were conspiring against him, and it was costing him his right to earn a living. He later on was able to get a job as a convenience store clerk. Much later, Sheila's boyfriend Dennis visited the family house with the intention to ask Ronald for Sheila's hand in marriage. Ronald was enraged by what he heard, especially when he was told that Dennis had already proposed to Sheila and all he visited for was to make further plans for their wedding and his marriage to Sheila. Ronald told Dennis that he wasn't going to allow Sheila and Sheila's daughter Sylvia, who was the offspring from Ronald and Sheila, to leave the house. Unknown to Ronald, Dennis already had a plan and had taken Sheila and Sylvia out of the house before Ronald got home. Ronald started drinking heavily after this event, and a few weeks later he quit his job at the convenience store. Most of the children had moved out by this time, and there were even rumors that Becky was having an affair. Ronald couldn't take it anymore. He felt he had lost control of his family after he'd tried so hard to keep them in his grips. He was frustrated and knew he had to find a way to restore his dominance over his family and punish them for all the wrong they'd done. For days after quitting his job on the 22nd of December, Ronald began his killings. It was around Christmas time. He knew most of his family would be visiting for the holidays, so he figured this was the perfect time to carry out the plan he had been brooding in his mind for so long. His first son, Ronald Gene Jr., who came visiting, was the first victim. While Gene was unaware, Ronald hit him in the center of his forehead with a crowbar. Ronald continued hitting him with a crowbar over and over. He didn't stop there. He pounded the boy's face with the crowbar one more time, breaking his nose. To make sure that Gene had no chance to survive, Ronald hit him with maximum impact on his skull. He then stomped on Gene's groin to make sure he was still unresponsive. Becky heard the sound coming from the beatings and tried to check for what was happening. Ronald heard her coming, so he hid when she saw the sight of her son covered in blood. Before her, she went into shock. She was so upset she didn't see Ronald coming. Before she even noticed him, Ronald hit her with the crowbar across her shoulders and she fell to the floor. He looked at her with so much revenge in his eyes. He felt Becky was the reason all his children rebelled. He looked at her as she crawled on the floor trying to get away from him. He hit her multiple times with the crowbar, breaking her ribs. He was determined to make it hurt as much as possible, so he struck her with the teeth of the crowbar and dislodged chunks of flesh from her body. Becky was dead by the time he finished beating her. To be sure she was dead, he shot her with a .22 caliber pistol in the back of her head. Barbara, Ronald and Becky's youngest daughter, was startled awake by the gunshot and began to cry. She continued crying and it became tiresome, so Ronald headed for her room with a gun concealed behind his back. He hid the pistol when he arrived at her bedside and wrapped his arms around her as if to console her. His hands moved up her back to her neck. And then he wrapped them around her throat and squeezed until he choked the last gust of breath out of her. Ronald then took the corpses of all those he had killed to the cesspit and tossed their bodies there. This is the same cesspit he asked the children to dig when they moved into the house. Barbara peed on herself from fear while Ronald choked her to death, so he put her body in a garbage bag and tossed her body beside her mother's. He then attached some barbed wire around the perimeter of the cesspit to prevent animals getting in. His final step was to douse the corpses of his wife and children with kerosene to prevent the strong odor of dead bodies. After these murders, Ronald waited patiently for the other children to get home from school. When their school bus finally dropped them off, he told them that he had presents for them but wanted to surprise them with them one at a time in their rooms. He first killed his daughter, 17-year-old Loretta. He took her into the living room through the doors that led outside. Loretta looked like Sheila and made him remember the way Sheila betrayed him. With that anger, he grabbed her hair and shoved her face into a water barrel filled with ice-cold water. She struggled but couldn't stop Ronald when she eventually died and her body went still. He brought her remains to the cesspit and threw her in with the rest. The three other children, Eddie, Marianne and Becky, were then killed in the same way and subsequently dumped in the cesspit. This was the first phase of the murders. Ronald would then have to wait for 4 more days to carry out the next round of killings. As it was the Christmas period, Ronald and his wife had invited the older Simmons children over to the house for celebrations on the 26th of December. This arrival was what Ronald Simmons was waiting for. The first to arrive were William H. Simmons, 23, his wife Ranada Mae Simmons, 21, and their son William H. Simmons, 3, who was 20 months old. According to reports, Ronald shot the 2 parents in the dining room, covered their bodies with coats and blankets, and left them by the dining table. He then strangled and drowned the baby and placed him into the trunk of a car behind the Simmons home. Next to arrive were Ronald's 24-year-old daughter Sheila and her husband, 33-year-old Dennis Raymond McNeld, who brought their children, 7-year-old Sylvia and 21-month-old Michael. When they walked in, they took a few paces before freezing at the sight of the corpses that were neatly arranged in a row horizontally, just like he did before Ronald shot both Sheila and Dennis. Ronald grabbed their 21-month-old son and choked him to death. Once he was dead, he took him outside and tossed him into a patch of mud. He strangled Sylvia to death as well and kept her body with the rest. Evidence showed that Ronald laid the bodies of his whole family in neat rows in the lounge. Their bodies were covered with coats except that of Sheila, who was covered by Rebecca Simmons' best tablecloth. He put Sheila and Dennis' son's body in the car's trunk and left it at a spot where broken down cars were often abandoned. He felt the boy was unworthy to decompose in the company of the rest of his family, being that he was the son of Dennis. After the murders, Ronald drove to a Sears store in Russellville where he picked up the Christmas gifts that he had previously ordered for his family. Later that night, he drove to a private club to drink and celebrate his successful plan before returning home, where he spent the rest of the evening and the following day drinking beer and watching television. Ronald's mission to avenge himself against all who had done wrong to him was not complete. However, the next day, on the morning of December 28, 1987, Ronald drove a car that had belonged to his son Ronald Jr. to a Walmart in Russellville, where he purchased another gun to use in the attack he was about to carry out. His first target was the Peel, Eddie and Gibbons law firm. Kathy Kendrick, who got him fired for sexual harassment, was still employed there, and he was about to take his revenge. He wore a cowboy hat as a disguise. Everybody in the office could hear the sound of Kathy screaming and then the gunshot. She died before the ambulance arrived. As of then, Ronald was not yet identified as the perpetrator. Next, he went to the Taylor Oil Company, where he shot and wounded Russell Rusty Taylor, the owner of the Sinclair Mini Mark, from which Ronald had recently resigned. He also shot and killed J.D. Jim Chaffin, a fireman and part-time truck driver for Taylor Oil. Chaffin was the only deceased victim who was a stranger to Ronald. Ronald shot at and missed another employee before exiting the building. Ronald then went to the Sinclair Mini Mart where he shot and wounded Robert Woolery and David Salater. His final target was the Woodline Motor Freight Company, where he located his former supervisor Joyce Butts and shot her in the head and chest, wounding her. He then took worker Vicky Jackson at gunpoint into the computer office and ordered her to call the police. "I've come to do what I wanted to do. It's all over now. I've gotten everybody who wanted to hurt me," he told her. But the killings didn't stop here. At the secluded house, too. Jim Chaffin and Kathy Kendrick were murdered publicly in Russellville on Monday morning, bringing the total number of bodies to 16 when the police arrived. Ronald handed over his gun and surrendered without any resistance throughout the 40-minute-long rampage. Ronald had killed 2 and injured 4 others. After the police arrested Ronald, they went to his house to investigate further and to find his motive for the murders. That is where they found the bodies of his 14 other victims. Ronald was sent to the Arkansas State Hospital in Little Rock for a competency evaluation by staff psychiatrist Dr. Irving Qua. Dr. Qua would later deem him sane and able to stand trial. A family friend told investigators that Becky had been saving up money to divorce Ronald when the killings happened. The former freight company supervisor who survived the shooting also testified that Ronald had yelled at her during a previous argument about pay. Investigators would later find a letter inside a safe deposit box between Ronald and his daughter Sheila. Ronald was angry that Sheila had revealed he was the father of her child, and he wrote he would see her in hell. When the prosecutor presented it in court, Ronald punched him in the face and tried to get a deputy's handgun before being removed from the courtroom. Conviction and sentencing. After the psychiatric evaluation, Ronald first went on trial for the murders of Kendrick and Chaffin and was found guilty on May 12, 1988, being sentenced to death. The jury selection for the first trial took less than 6 hours. On May 16, Judge John Samuel Patterson sentenced Ronald to death by lethal injection plus 147 years. Ronald refused all rights to appeal. He would then go on to make the statement, "I, Ronald Gene Simmons Sr., want it to be known that it is my wish and my desire that absolutely no action by anybody be taken to appeal or in any way change this sentence. It is further respectfully requested that the sentence be carried out expeditiously." He next went on trial for the murders of his 14 family members and was found guilty on February 10, 1989, again being sentenced to death by lethal injection. He also refused to appeal his death sentence, stating to those who oppose the death penalty, "In my particular case, anything short of death would be cruel and unusual punishment." The trial court conducted a hearing concerning Ronald's competence to waive further proceedings and concluded that his decision was knowing and intelligent. Ronald became the subject of the United States Supreme Court case Whitmore v. Arkansas when another death row inmate, Jonas Whitmore, attempted unsuccessfully to force an appeal of Ronald's case. Reverend Louis Fraun and Jonas Whitmore contended that Ronald, using his right to refuse appeal, in fact jeopardized the appellate rights of other death row inmates, but by a 7-2 vote the Supreme Court justices threw out this appeal. However, the ongoing legal proceedings had prevented Ronald's execution from being carried out. Ronald was watching television and eating what he thought would be his last meal when the news of his stay of execution was announced. In an interesting turn of events, while on death row, Ronald had to be separated from other prisoners as his life was threatened constantly. This was because he refused to appeal his death sentence, and the other prisoners believed Ronald was damaging their chances of beating their own death sentences. On May 31, 1990, Governor Bill Clinton signed Ronald's second execution warrant for June 25, 1990. This was the quickest sentence to execution to death time in United States history since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976 Ronald refused all visitors including legal counsel and clergy. His last words were, "Justice delayed finally be done is justifiable homicide." No family members claimed the body, so Ronald was buried in a pauper's plot at Lincoln Memorial Lawn in Varner, Lincoln County. Story 5. Now we're going to be looking at another twisted case with you. In April 2011, a horrifying tragedy unfolded in Nantes, France. The wife and children of nobleman Xavier Dupont-Dionate were found dead and buried underneath the family's back porch. The French press named the case Les Maisons de l'Épouvante, or the House of Terror. What's worse, Xavier Dupont-Dionate had completely disappeared, and this made him the prime suspect in the murder of his own family. Our love and respect goes out to all those who knew and loved the victims and all those affected by this case. Xavier, his wife Agnes, and their 4 children were seen as a picture-perfect family by those who knew them. Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès, the father, was a descendant of old French aristocracy. His father, Bernard Hubert Dupont de Ligonnès, was a count, and Xavier was very proud of his noble heritage. He even once said, "I think I've got a superiority complex, you could call it that. I belong to a group of people who are intelligent, determined, balanced, and in good moral and physical health. Such people are rare compared to the masses." Born in Versailles, he was raised in a strict upperist Catholic society that was well-to-do but also conservative. Around the age of 10, his father grew tired of the society of Versailles and left the city, leaving Xavier in the care of his grandmother. But despite looking like a traditional aristocrat, Xavier craved adventure deeply. When he was 20 years old, Xavier met Agnes Hodonger, another young member of the Versailles bourgeoisie. Although they claimed to be in love, Xavier wasn't ready to settle down and eventually left the town. Upon his return, he found that Agnes had become pregnant by another man. Despite the social norms, he married her anyway and adopted the boy as his own. But Xavier and Agnes didn't stay in Versailles. They spent the 1990s traveling around France as their family grew. In the early 2000s, they attempted to immigrate to Florida but were unsuccessful. Although the process lost the family a lot of money, they eventually settled down to what appeared to be a happy, quiet life in Nantes. Their eldest child, Arthur, was 20 years old in 2011 and enrolled in a private Catholic college nearby. Thomas, the second oldest, at 18, and Xavier's first biological son, was studying music at college, and their only daughter was a pretty and intelligent 16-year-old who modeled for mail order catalogs part-time while maintaining good grades at La Perverie, the private Catholic school she attended. With Benoist, just 13 at the time of his death, was popular and well-liked. Agnes, devoutly religious, worked as an assistant in a Catholic school. From an external perspective, the Dupont-Diogons family seemed to embody the ideal of a golden family from the aristocracy. Living in a nice home with both parents seemingly successful in their respective roles, they were esteemed and well regarded within their community and enjoyed the respect and admiration of the others. But despite the appearance of an almost perfect couple, the couple had been having marriage problems as early as 2002. Agnes complained online, "Xavier is too judgmental, too quick to argue, too rigid, too military. There's no more tenderness between us, no more attention, no softness, no sex. When I ask him if he's happy, his response is the same: yes, I am, but if we could all die tomorrow, that would be better." A suburban house in the French town of Nantes. It was here in the garden that police searching for a missing family made a grisly discovery: a severed human leg buried in the ground. Further searches turned up 5 bodies. The Dupont-Diogons' marital problems worsened in 2005. Agnes even filed a police report against her husband for attacking Arthur, her eldest son. Financial problems worsened their relationship. Despite his aristocratic pedigree, Xavier had failed to create a steady career for himself. He had started a series of businesses, including running a hotel guide and membership card program, but none ever became successful. They relied mostly on money inherited from Agnes' family, and by 2011 that money was in danger of running out. Xavier had mired himself in debt and was becoming increasingly desperate. He'd taken up a mistress in Paris and had even been forced to borrow €50,000 from her out of desperation. In an email to her in 2010, he shared that he was ruined at rock bottom like never before. I am awake almost every night with these morbid ideas, burning down the house after giving everyone sleeping pills, or killing myself so that Agnes gets €600,000. In any case, my life will end in the next few months if I don't get €25,000 immediately. Most of the time I am not in a dream but in a nightmare, and I can't escape except of course by doing something radical and final. In January 2011, just 3 months prior to the murders, Xavier's father, the Count Bernard Hubert Dupont d'Agans, passed away. After his death, Xavier went through his father's belongings looking for things of value, but his father had also had financial problems and had been living near poverty before he died. The following month, Xavier got his gun license and started frequenting a shooting range just outside Nantes, sometimes bringing his sons along. In the weeks leading up to the Dupont d'Agans murders, Xavier also bought cement, chalk, lime bullets, cleaning supplies, garbage bags, a spade and a trolley. Witnesses mentioned seeing Xavier loading things into his car in the week before he completely disappeared. Xavier had also paid off some remaining debts, including the final bills for his children's private schools, before closing all the bank accounts in the Dupont d'Agans name. The lease on the family home had recently been terminated, and a final note was taped to the mailbox stating, "Please return all mail to sender, thank you." A sign for the postman said, "Return to sender." On April 11, La Perverie, the school and in Benino attended, received a note from Xavier saying he was pulling them out as the family was planning a sudden move to Australia for business. About 10 days ago I got a letter from the father saying he was going to work in Australia, and so the children wouldn't be coming to school anymore. The school where Agnes worked received a similar message. The messages said Agnes wanted to quit her position immediately due to her husband's job transfer. However, her boss was unable to reach her when she reached out to follow up on her quick departure. The first sign of anything suspicious came on April 1 when Arthur Dupont d'Agans, the eldest child, did not show up to the restaurant where he worked to pick up his paycheck, but just 2 days later the rest of the family was seen out at a restaurant having a seemingly happy dinner together. That evening, April 3, was the last time the two youngest children and in Benoist would be seen alive. The children did not attend school the following day, supposedly due to an illness. Thomas, the second oldest child, had gone back to school on April 4 but had been called back home by his father, who told him there had been a family emergency that night. Xavier traveled down to Angers to have dinner with his son Thomas at a high-end restaurant called Leroy Cato. The waiters recalled that Thomas seemed to be feeling unwell for much of the meal, and that father and son barely talked to each other for the entire night. The following days were filled with odd messages from Thomas mentioning illness and problems with his phone charger. Concerns grew when he missed important commitments like a music rehearsal. The family dogs barked for 2 days straight before they fell silent on April 6. Arthur's girlfriend, worried by his silence, visited their home in Nantes. Although there were lights inside and the dogs didn't bark like they usually do, no one answered her knocks. The next day, on April 7, witnesses observed Xavier loading several large bags into his car. That same day, neighbors claimed to have seen Agnes, though the timing remains to be inconsistent with the evidence. By April 8, Xavier's actions took a strange turn. He used the family's IP address to send messages, a post on a Catholic board, and emails to relatives to assure them he was fine. Then on April 11, and in Benoist School received a letter announcing their departure to Australia, citing urgent career changes for the Family. The letter dated April 11, which has fueled numerous theories surrounding the case of Xavier and Agnes Dupont de Lagan, is central to the mystery in this strange rambling 4-page letter. Xavier claimed that the family had been relocated to the United States under the Federal Witness Protection Program due to his covert work for the DEA. He told their family not to contact them for several years and urged them to tell the story that they had moved to Australia because work. However, the letter was unsigned and had grammatical errors, which was uncharacteristic of him. On April 11, Xavier began his journey, starting with a night at the hotel Premier Class near Toulouse, far away from Rennes. The next evening he moved further southeast to the province Alpes Côte d'Azur region, where he checked into the Alberts de Cassagne under the alias Mr. Lawrence Xavier, paying €214 with his credit card. Meanwhile, back in Nantes, concerns were mounting over the Dupont Diagon's family. Neighbors noticed the house had been quiet and closed up for about a week with Anis's car unmoved. They then decided to call the police for a wellness check, finding the house locked and unresponsive. The police had to call a locksmith to gain entry inside. Apart from some bed sheets removed and closet doors open, everything seemed to be normal, leading police to initially believe the family had left voluntarily. That evening, Xavier stayed at a hotel in La Sainte-Terre on the French Riviera, a place where he had a history from the 1980s. Despite reaching out to a former girlfriend that night, they did not meet in person. On April 14, Xavier withdrew €30 from an ATM and spent the night at the Hotel Formula 1 in Roquebon-sur-Argent, located on the southeastern coast of France near Canon-Nice. This location would be the furthest point he had been from Nantes within France. Surveillance cameras captured him that night, marking the last confirmed sighting. The following day, April 15, Xavier checked out of the hotel and vanished without a trace. He left his car behind at the hotel to walk or perhaps use public transportation, and since then there have been no further sightings or clues to his whereabouts. On April 15, after Xavier's disappearance and the unusual letter sent to family members, police conducted another search of the house. This time they realized that the photos were removed from picture frames, which possibly suggested that whoever left did not plan to return. Despite these strange findings, nothing extremely suspicious was found. Agnes' family, growing increasingly concerned, pressured the police for further investigations. Subsequent visits on April 18, 19, and 20 also had no significant findings. It wasn't until April 21, during the police's final search of the residence, that the horrifying truth came to light. Buried under the patio in the backyard, police discovered 2 graves. The bodies, wrapped in blankets and duvet covers, were found inside plastic bags alongside small religious items, suggesting a religious burial attempt. Rapid testing confirmed the identities of the bodies: Agnes Arthur Thomas and Anne Benoist Dupont de Lagan, along with the family's 2 Labrador dogs. An autopsy conducted the next day revealed chilling details. All the children had been drugged with sleeping pills and shot twice in the head with a rifle. Agnes, whose sleep apnea machine stopped at 3:00 a.m. on April 4, was likely the first victim. Her body, along with those of Arthur and Anne Benoist, was discovered in one grave, while Thomas was found in a separate one, which indicated he may have been killed on a different day. But despite the gruesome murders, no traces of blood were found in the house. Shockingly, Xavier Dupont Diagon's was nowhere to be found. With his family dead and his whereabouts unknown, he quickly became the prime suspect. Police in western France have found the bodies of a mother and her 4 children buried under the terrace of their house in Nantes. They'd been missing since the beginning of April. The family's 2 pet dogs were buried alongside. A major police hunt is on for the father, 50-year-old Xavier Dupont de Lyons. He told friends that he was a secret agent and had to leave the country. They were also told that his wife, 49-year-old Agnes, and their 4 children aged 13 to 21 were immigrating the day after the bodies were discovered. An international arrest warrant was issued for him. By then he had already gained a significant head start on law enforcement, leaving behind a trail of mystery and unanswered questions despite thorough efforts over 2 months, including combing through mountainous terrains and caves with mountain guides. No significant leads were uncovered besides Xavier's abandoned car and surveillance footage. The most puzzling thing in this investigation was that Xavier's behavior post-disappearance contradicted the way he meticulously cleaned the crime scene. He freely used his credit card at restaurants, withdrew cash from ATMs, and was caught multiple times on CCTV cameras. This unwillingness to escape made police think that Xavier had no intention of fleeing justice but was rather on a goodbye journey. This aligned with patterns observed in similar cases where killers often take their own lives following familial homicides. Many of the places Xavier visited during this period held personal significance, having been his former residences and the birthplaces of his children. The last CCTV image of him carrying a bag suspected to contain a rifle was caught in Roquebon-sur-Giant. Police believe he may have ended his life in the nearby forest despite his body never being recovered. Nancy prosecutor Bridget Lamy disclosed that suicide in the forest remains the leading theory, with no viable alternative explanation put forward by investigators, while family annihilators typically choose immediate suicide. Xavier's prolonged travels after the killings suggest a more complex psychological state. The case of Xavier Dupont Diagon's and the tragic events at 55 Boulevard Robert Schumann sparked media frenzy and earned the nickname the House of Terror across French newspapers. Over the years, multiple search efforts have been conducted to find Xavier, starting with extensive cave searches in June 2011 within a 10 miles radius of his last known whereabouts. Despite all the efforts of caving experts, no traces of Xavier were found. Subsequent searches in 2013 also focused on the mountainous regions nearby, yet these too yielded no definitive clues about Xavier's fate. In 2013 a body was discovered approximately 12 miles from where Xavier was last seen, which led to speculation, but inconclusive results from the autopsy ruled out the possibility that it was Xavier. Another discovery in 2015 also confirmed through DNA testing that the body did not belong to him. Despite these false leads, the common belief among investigators is that Xavier likely took his own life, with suicide standing as the primary theory regarding his disappearance. Following his disappearance after the tragic murders of his family, investigators believed his final journey to be southern France, particularly around Roquebon-sur-Argent, possibly intended as an area to commit suicide. The area's rugged terrain with cliffs, mountains and crevices seemed good enough to hide a body. This fueled the belief among police that he may have planned the trip to southern France not to escape but to disappear on purpose. In July 2015, nearly 4 years after the murders and his disappearance, a potential lead emerged when a photograph believed to be of Arthur and Benoist, his 2 sons, was sent to a journalist in N. The back of the photo bore a handwritten note stating "I'm still alive," along with a date in Xavier's name. However, the authenticity of the letter could not be verified and police were unable to trace its origin definitively. Then in 2018, police received a tip that he was hiding in a monastery in Roquebon-sur-Argent, possibly disguised as a monk. This tip sparked a police raid on the monastery, but their search did not uncover Xavier. It turned out to be a case of mistaken identity, but the most infamous sighting of Xavier since his disappearance occurred on October 11, 2019 and resulted in an arrest that sparked widespread attention and speculation. Police in London received an alert through advanced passenger information forms which indicated that a passenger traveling from Paris to Glasgow had used a stolen French passport. This triggered concerns that the passenger might be Xavier and prompted French authorities to prepare for his arrival at Charles de Gaulle Airport, but the man unexpectedly changed his flight and arrived in Glasgow. A day earlier, Scottish police intercepted the man and took his fingerprints, which initially led them to believe they had had Xavier. This news created a media frenzy celebrating the apparent end to a lengthy manhunt for a man accused of a notorious crime, but doubts emerged upon reviewing CCTV footage at the airport, where police noted significant inconsistencies in appearance between the detained man and Xavier, a murder suspect who has been on the run from French police for 8 years, has reportedly been arrested in the Scottish city of Glasgow. Javier Dupont de Leon is accused of having shot dead his wife and 4 children at their home in Notts in 2011. Their bodies were found buried in concrete under the garden. Prosecutors said the killings were methodical. Subsequent fingerprinting and DNA tests definitively proved that the man was not Xavier, but a 69-year-old French national with Portuguese origins, traveling to visit his Scottish wife. This case led to criticism toward the French media and police for announcing Xavier's arrest without thorough verification of the man's identity. Since this incident in 2019, there have been no reports regarding Xavier's whereabouts, leaving his fate and location in mystery. Some who knew the Frenchman remained convinced that he is not only dead but also innocent. They believe that the doing husband and father they knew would never have murdered his wife and children. Initially, Sister Christine criticized the legitimacy of the letter he allegedly sent, which claimed the family had been relocated to the U.S. under the Witness Protection Program. Over the years, Christine's stance evolved. She believed that he and his family indeed moved to the U.S., which was inconsistent with the forensic evidence and investigations into the deaths. Her skepticism extended to the identification of the bodies found under the porch, questioning whether they truly belonged to Agnes and the children. This skepticism arose partly due to procedural concerns such as the quick burial approval and the family's advice not to view the bodies, but despite these doubts, no credible alternative theory has surfaced regarding the identity of the bodies. Christine presented several arguments challenging the official narrative surrounding her brother's case. One piece of evidence she highlighted was an email he allegedly sent in 2010, where he speculated about accidents that might happen in his family in the future. The email ended with a statement expressing hope that his family would not believe he caused these accidents on purpose, even if the evidence suggested otherwise. Christine and her husband interpreted this email as evidence of a potential conspiracy against him. They suggested that someone may have been plotting to frame him for the murder of his family or to somehow implicate him in the context of their supposed entry into the Witness Protection Program, but the police believed he had been planning the murders for some time and may have been preparing to manipulate his family's perceptions of his innocence. In her blog, Christine also raised doubts about his physical capability to bury Agnes and the children underneath the porch. The space under the porch was relatively low, only about 1.2 m high, which would have required someone to work on their hands and knees without the aid of long tools like shovels or hose that he had purchased. Given his reported back and neck problems, Christine questioned whether he would have been physically able to carry out such a task alone, but these arguments against his guilt primarily rest on personal relationships and familial loyalty rather than concrete evidence contradicting the police investigation. The forensic evidence, including DNA and ballistics analysis, points right at Xavier as the person responsible for the murders, but what made him lead to such a point? There are several important points that can potentially explain the motive of the murders. At first, despite the noble title of Count, his aristocratic lineage did not come with wealth or power. In modern times, the French Revolution had abolished the legal privileges of the nobility, and many families, including the Dupont de Legans, had lost their ancestral wealth over the centuries. Xavier attempted a fresh start in the United States in the early 2000s, likely seeking better prospects or a new beginning. However, this move failed, and the financial strain from this setback may have worsened his mental state. Back in France, he portrayed himself as a successful businessman, but in reality his ventures were not profitable. Killing his family and attempting to disappear could be interpreted as an attempt to regain control over a life that he perceived as spiraling out of control. It could also have been a misguided attempt to protect them from receiving threats, or to escape from mounting pressures and failures. By the end of the 2000s, it was becoming more and more clear that the money was drying up and that eventually he would have to leave behind aspects of his aristocratic life, such as the nice house. However, according to friends and family, what was more important to him was, in effect, his pride. He didn't want to be revealed as a fraud, as someone unsuccessful, especially to his children. The death of Xavier's father Hubert in January 2011, just 3 months before the murders of his wife and children, was an important event in his life that some have believed may have influenced his actions. Hubert's passing left him searching through his father's belongings, reportedly looking for money or valuables that might have been stashed away, but he found none. Instead, he came across a rifle which he later used to kill his family. The fate of Xavier Dupont d'Agon's remains one of the biggest unsolved mysteries in recent French criminal history. Despite extensive investigations and numerous reported sightings over the years, Xavier managed to evade capture and his whereabouts remain unknown. At first, the police believe that he committed suicide, likely in the forests near Roquebon-sur-Argent, where he was last seen, but the proximity of Roquebon-sur-Argent to the sea and its well-connected transportation links raised the possibility that he could have left France undetected. He could speak French, English and Spanish, which would have enabled him to potentially blend into some countries abroad. There are many theories as to where Dupont d'Agon's might be hiding, since he knew enough English and Spanish to get by. One theory is that he fled to Latin America on a cargo ship. Another theory suggests he underwent plastic surgery and has been living in Scotland all this time. The problem in this case is that Xavier Dupont d'Agon's looks a bit like everybody else with no strong features, said John Mark Block, a retired police investigator familiar with the case. He's of average height. Physically he doesn't stand out. He's physically normal, and there's nothing worse in this situation than physically normal people, because they both stay unnoticed and they draw too much attention. Up until this day, Xavier Dupont d'Agon has never been formally charged with the murders, and so the case of the Dupont d'Agon's murders remains technically unresolved. But since the launch of the Unsolved Mysteries series, the police have received 20 new credible tips from viewers about the cases featured on the show. One of the most recent tips received after the launch of the series was from an eyewitness who claimed to have seen Dupont d'Agon's in America on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. The witness even sent in a photo they took of the alleged suspect. A producer on the show admitted that the person in the photo looked quite a bit like the Frenchman. Whether this sighting gives way to a new lead or not, perhaps one day a tip will lead authorities straight to Xavier Dupont d'Agon's, but for now no one can say for sure where he went. Story 6. The bodies were there the whole time, hidden in plain sight. At first they looked like nothing more than a pile of clothes, but later a gruesome discovery would be made, changing the history of Bellevue as a safe haven for families. Four family members were slaughtered on the night of January 3, 1997. And the one responsible was too young to drink, too composed to panic, and far too calculated to kill alone. This wasn't just murder, it was a performance in cold blood, rehearsed and carried out by someone who should have been too innocent to even understand death. It started like any other winter afternoon. Cold, gray, quiet, the kind of stillness that makes everything feel harmless, almost dull. In a sleepy corner of Bellevue just outside Seattle, two young boys were playing in a neighborhood park. As they darted through the open field and wandered toward the brush lining the edge of the park, one of them paused, hidden halfway under the leaves tucked into a small cluster of bushes was something odd. It looked like a pile of old clothes, maybe dumped by a careless hiker or a passerby. They gave it a passing glance, shrugged it off and went back to playing, but something about it Lingered kids noticed things adults often don't. Maybe it was just a gut feeling they couldn't explain. The next day curiosity pulled them. Back they walked to the same spot, and there it was again, only now they saw it for what it really was, a dead body. They ran straight home, voices trembling, hearts pounding. One of their mothers called the police immediately. Within minutes Bellevue officers were on the scene. What they found confirmed the boy's worst fear. Lying cold in the brush was the body of a young woman. She had dark hair, a small frame, and bruises that spoke of a violent struggle. Her face was swollen, her hands scraped. There was a cord still wrapped tightly around her neck, as if the killer had wanted to be sure, absolutely sure, she would never take another breath. Her name, police would later confirm, was Kimberly Wilson. She was just 20 years old. At first nothing about her made sense. She didn't have enemies, she didn't live a high-risk lifestyle. She was a college student, bright, social, full of plans and promise, the kind of girl who was supposed to be safe in a place like Bellevue. But now she was gone, and whoever had done it hadn't even tried to hide her. Well, that suggested confidence or carelessness, or maybe just pure evil, the kind that doesn't worry about the mere existence of law. Detectives knew there were still pieces missing. The Wilson family hadn't reported her missing. No one from her home had reached out. That wasn't like them, and something felt off. So Bellevue officers made their way to the Wilson residence, a well-kept suburban home tucked into a quiet neighborhood that still had its Christmas lights up, twinkling faintly in the early morning gloom. But there was an eerie stillness hanging over the place. 3 cars were parked outside, but the house itself was dark, a silence so unnatural it made the hair on the back of Detective Jeff Gomez neck stand up. As he approached the house, Gomez noticed that the sliding glass door in the back was slightly ajar. He paused, called out their names, but there was nothing, not a single sound from inside. With his weapon drawn and every nerve on edge, Gomez stepped cautiously into the house. He moved slowly, scanning every corner. The air was thick still. He crept up the stairs, half hoping he'd find the family asleep, maybe unaware of the chaos unfolding outside. But what he found at the top of the stairs was worse than anything he had imagined. Blood everywhere. It painted the walls and speckled the ceiling. It had soaked into the carpet. It was the kind of scene that didn't leave much to the imagination. The violence had been close, intimate, and rage-fueled, the kind of killing that felt personal. In the master bedroom, the horror deepened. Lying on the bed was Rose Wilson, Kimberly's mother. Her body had been brutally attacked, multiple stab wounds to the throat. Her face had been beaten so viciously it was almost unrecognizable. Her head crushed under what detectives would later determine was a heavy blunt object. The sheets beneath her were drenched. Not far from her, at the foot of the bed, lay William Bill Wilson, Kim's father. He had suffered the same fate, bludgeoned, stabbed, left to die beside the woman he'd built a life with. But it didn't end there. In the hallway just outside the bedroom, Gomez made another devastating discovery. Kimberly's 17-year-old sister Julia. Her body was crumpled on the floor. Unlike her parents, she hadn't gone without a fight. Her arm was broken, likely in self-defense. Her face and neck were punctured with multiple stab wounds. Whoever had come into that house had been relentless. They hadn't just wanted to kill, they wanted to destroy. Within minutes, the Wilson home was a fully active crime scene. Yellow tape cameras, gloved hands carefully collecting fragments of a family shattered beyond recognition. For members of one household, mother, father, and 2 daughters, now all victims of a massacre that had started with Kimberly and led police straight into something much bigger. The question now wasn't just who had done this, it was why and how could anyone do something this savage, this calculated, and walk away. What detectives would uncover next would answer those questions, but the truth would be darker than anything they were prepared for. As the full weight of the Wilson family massacre sank into the community, Bellevue detectives sprang into action. This wasn't just another homicide, it was the systematic slaughter of an entire family in their own home. Someone had walked into that house with the intent to wipe out every last member. There were No signs of forced entry. This was definitely not a robbery gone wrong. It was personal and with a purpose. Detectives knew that whoever was behind this didn't just want the Wilsons dead, they wanted them obliterated. Investigators began going around in the neighborhood. They went door to door asking anyone who lived nearby if they'd seen or heard anything unusual, but in a place like Bellevue where everyone minds their own business and violence is something that happens somewhere else, few had anything useful to say. No one heard screams or loud bangs. It was just another quiet night in suburbia. They turned to the Wilsons' backgrounds. Bill was a respected engineer. His co-workers described him as solid, dependable, one of those guys who showed up early and stayed late. His boss called him loyal, the kind of employee you could always count on. Rose, his wife, worked in retail. Her co-workers said she was warm, outgoing, always smiling. Julia, their youngest, was a senior in high school. Quiet, shy, sweet. Her classmates said the kind of girl who didn't make waves. Nothing added up. They were a normal family. They had no enemies whatsoever. But when detectives started looking closer at Kimberly, the daughter whose body had been discovered in the park, they started finding small cracks in the picture-perfect frame. Kim had graduated from the same high school Julia still attended. On the surface, she was just another young woman trying to figure life out, but her school counselor remembered things differently. She recalled tension between Kim and her parents, especially during her final years in school. There were some arguments between them, the kind of slow building strain that doesn't explode overnight but develops quietly behind closed doors. That tension, it turned out, hadn't gone unnoticed. Records showed that a year before the murders, a neighbor had actually called the police to report a domestic disturbance at the Wilson home, reporting screaming and fighting, the usual stuff of teenage rebellion. But looking back now, it felt like an early warning sign. No one had really understood. Detectives dug deeper. They began reaching out to Kimberly's circle, her friends, classmates, anyone who had insight into her personal life. That's when a strange pattern began to emerge. Kim, by most accounts, wasn't wild. She didn't party hard or spend late nights doing drugs, but she had a few friends who lived on the fringe, a group of kids who gathered late at night at the local Denny's. They called themselves the Saturday Night Denny's Club. On the surface, it sounded harmless: teenagers drinking bad coffee, staying up too late, trying to be edgy. But the more the police learned, the darker it got. Members of the group, dressed in black, embraced gothic subculture and liked to roleplay. Not your average fantasy games. These had themes that revolved around violence, power, eroticism, and death. It was the kind of escapism that let them feel important, different, above the boredom that surrounded them. For most, it was just talk, a way to rebel, to feel alive. But not all of them. Multiple people pointed to two names, two boys in the group who, according to several members, talked openly about murder, and they would do it almost all the time as if it were a joke. They spoke of it so often it stopped raising eyebrows, like it was just another part of their strange Denny's world. But now, in the wake of 4 brutal murders, detectives couldn't ignore it. The investigation was no longer just about who had done it. It was now about who had spoken about it, who had fantasized about death enough to make it real. And behind the smiles, the black clothes, the talk of rebellion, police were about to uncover something much more sinister. They were hunting a killer, and he was young, too young, and he hadn't done it alone. The trail was starting to heat up, with whispers pointing toward the same 2 names over and over again. Detectives decided it was time to pay a visit to Banai and Anderson. Both boys were part of the Denny's group, the late night misfits, with a taste of rebellion, and both had already raised eyebrows by casually talking about murder in a way that now felt less like teenage adventure stories and more like foreshadowing. When officers arrived at their homes, the boys didn't seem rattled. In fact, they seemed calm for people who had just heard of a murder within their own group. Banai in particular spoke with an eerie kind of detachment. He told detectives that on the night of the murders, he and Anderson had been holed up at his place playing video games for hours. He described it as a quite boring night, in nothing unusual It was a story that seemed convenient, too convenient, but the detectives were not ready to build trust with these kids just yet. They started looking for inconsistencies, and one of the first things they zeroed in on were the shoes. A distinctive shoe tread had been found at the Wilson crime scene. It wasn't just any generic sole, it had a specific pattern that left a deep, unmistakable print in the bloodied carpet. Investigators asked Bani to show them his shoes. He complied, pulling out a pair of brown work shoes and telling them those were the only ones he owned. Nothing out of the ordinary, he said, just regular shoes. But Bani wasn't counting on people-talking witnesses. That involved both neighbors and classmates started chipping away at his carefully built alibi. One of his own friends told detectives that Bani actually did own boots, not the brown work shoes he showed police, but a different pair, ones with soles that looked disturbingly similar to the prints found in the Wilsons' blood-soaked home. And that alibi about playing video games all night started falling apart just as quickly. Neighbors of Bani told investigators they hadn't seen Anderson at the house that night. They had heard him pulling all-nighters before, but that night wasn't one of them. The truth was unraveling piece by piece as detectives dug back into the crime scene. They discovered something chilling that hadn't been obvious at first: two distinct types of bloody footprints, not just one set of shoes walking through the carnage, but two that changed everything. It confirmed what police were already beginning to suspect. This hadn't been a solo job, it had been a team effort. At least two people had walked into the Wilson home that night, fully intent on wiping out an entire family, together, coordinated, and now the evidence was starting to whisper names: Bani and Anderson. They had blood on their hands, and Bellevue detectives were getting closer to proving it. The truth, when it came, was worse than anyone imagined. 5 days after that first round of questioning, detectives circled back to Bani. Something had changed in his demeanor. The mask was slipping. Maybe it was the pressure, maybe it was the guilt, or just the lack of it, but he folded without much prompting. He began to talk. And once he started, he didn't stop. There was no emotion, no visible remorse, just a cold, clinical recounting of events, as if he were describing something he'd seen in a movie instead of something he had done with his own hands. He told investigators that he had killed Kimberly Wilson first, and that he strangled her in the dark, quiet park, left her body hidden in the brush, and then he walked away. But that night, something gnawed at him, a loose end. He told detectives that he suddenly panicked, realizing Kim might have told her parents where she was going, who she was meeting. What if they knew? What if they figured it out? And that's when his mind made a pivot, a logical step in his twisted reasoning. If they knew, they had to die too. Bani didn't hesitate. He armed himself with a baseball bat and a combat knife and made his way to the Wilson residence, a home he had visited before, a family that had welcomed him in, not knowing they were embracing a monster. He slipped in quietly through a sliding glass door that had been left slightly open. Rose Wilson was the first to die. She was asleep in her bed when Bani raised the bat and brought it down on her head. Again and again the sound of her screams woke Bill Wilson, who charged in to protect his wife, but he was no match for a bat and a knife wielded by a teenager who had come there with only the intention to kill. Bani turned on him next, striking, stabbing, letting the man die with his own hands. And when both parents were finally still, he moved through the house with the calm of someone finishing a task. Upstairs he found Julia, and God, she did fight hard, but he was stronger, all because he was armed. He broke her arm, stabbed her repeatedly, making sure no one was left behind. Before leaving, he didn't run. He looted the house, casually picking up the things he liked: a telephone, a CD player, a VCR. As if the night hadn't already been soaked in horror, he decided to rob the family too, and then he walked out of the Wilson house into the stillness of the early morning, having erased 4 lives in a matter of minutes. Even after admitting to the killings, Bani kept one final secret close to his chest. He refused to name the second person who had walked with him into that house of blood. But silence doesn't hold forever. The detectives already had a name in mind: David Anderson. He'd been questioned before his name had floated around in the darker corners of Kim's social circle, but now with Banai's confession out, Anderson's presence in the story felt heavier, more suspicious, so they brought him back. In this time Anderson's story shifted. He claimed he had lied before. He hadn't been playing video games with Banai the night of the murders as he originally said. Instead, he told investigators he'd been out driving a truck owned by his girlfriend's father, supposedly traveling between Bellevue and Seattle, a long night drive all alone. Detectives took it all in, they wrote it down, but they didn't buy it because along with the fresh confession came another crack in the alibi. Anderson now admitted that he knew Banai had been planning to kill the Wilson family, not just talking nonsense like teens sometimes do, but planning seriously. And for a while now, Anderson told police that his connection to the Wilsons came through Kim. He said they were friends, that's all, and that Banai's connection to her came through him. But the deeper detectives went, the more that explanation started to unravel. 3 neighbors independent of each other reported something that pulled Anderson deeper into the web. Each claimed they had seen both Banai and Anderson leaving the Banai residence together on the night the Wilsons were murdered. Same time, same direction, 2 boys walking into the dark. Detectives didn't need a confession to keep digging. They executed search warrants on both Banais and Anderson's homes, and there inside the walls and closets of their teenage bedrooms they found the final pieces of horror: the stolen items from the Wilson's house, the CD player, the telephone, the VCR had been casually tucked away as if they weren't soaked in the memory of violence. But more damning than the electronics were the shoes, bloody tread matching, still sitting there like nothing had happened. The soles matched the prints from the Wilson home, and DNA testing didn't lie. Traces of blood from multiple Wilson family members were found on those items, on those shoes. The evidence was conclusive. It wasn't just Banai. Anderson had walked through the blood too. He could shift stories, he could deny what he wanted, but the truth was embedded in every drop, every fiber, every inch of that crime scene, and it followed him home. Eventually the law caught up to Anderson too. Banai had wielded the weapons, yes, he had delivered the fatal blows, but Anderson had been there. He had known, he had walked beside him, and the justice system held him accountable for it. 2 boys, 1 plan for lives ended, and Bellevue, once a quiet suburban haven, would never be the same. When the trials finally began in October 1998, the courtroom was packed. The air felt heavy, not just with grief but with rage and disbelief, the need for answers that would likely never come. Prosecutors initially attempted to try Banai and Anderson together. After all, they had walked side by side into the night that took the Wilson family, but the court disagreed. These were 2 different minds, 2 different levels of involvement, and most importantly 2 different types of manipulation at play. In the end, it was decided that they would face justice separately. Banai went first. The trial dragged through the dark details, every swing of the bat, every stab, every lie, but Banai didn't react. He didn't flinch. He sat there stone-faced like he was watching a documentary about someone else. When the jury found him guilty, no one in the room was surprised. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each life he stole, without the possibility of parole. And when asked if he had anything to say, anything at all, he simply shrugged and said, "No, I don't think so." He did not feel the need to apologize, showed no emotion or even a hint of humanity, just cold silence. Banai began his sentence a week later, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives and unanswered questions. Anderson's trial took longer. He fought tooth and nail, hired and fired lawyers like it was a game, a desperate attempt to shift blame, to twist timelines, to wriggle his way out of a sentence he knew was coming. But the evidence was louder than his lawyers, the shoes, the witnesses, the lies that kept changing. In the end, it was all there in black and white, right there in front of everyone. A month and a half later, Anderson too was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms, no possibility of parole, another name inked into the long list of those who had chosen destruction over decency for years. That was the end. But then Everything changed because the system, like time shifts in the years that followed, laws changed, prosecutors say. Alex Banney planned to murder the Wilson family before he turned 18 so he'd get a lighter sentence. He was convicted in adult court and sentenced to life in prison without parole, but nearly 3 decades and a Supreme Court ruling later, he learned today his sentence will be reduced. What seemed like the end for Banney and Anderson turned out to be just another turning point in a story already steeped in pain. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court made a ruling that would shake the justice system to its core, declaring that sentencing juveniles to life without the possibility of parole violated the Eighth Amendment's protection against cruel and unusual punishment. The court acknowledged what science had long been whispering: the adolescent brain isn't finished, it's impulsive, it lacks foresight, it makes reckless, sometimes catastrophic decisions, and while that might explain the chaos of youth, could it ever excuse what happened to the Wilson family in 2018? The state of Washington followed suit. It drew a hard line in the sand, acknowledging that juveniles must be treated differently in the eyes of the law, even those who commit unthinkable crimes, even those who walk into homes with knives and bats, even those who leave behind silence and blood. Under this new ruling, Banney's original sentence for consecutive life terms without parole was vacated. Prosecutors were ordered to seek a new sentence, one that fit within the revised legal framework. The minimum was now set at 25 years to life. It was no exoneration, it wasn't freedom, but it was a door left cracked open in October 2024. That door creaked wider for Banney, just like it had for Anderson 2 years earlier. Both were resentenced under the new law. Both now have the possibility, however distant, of parole. MR and MRS Wilson's bedroom to murder them. Alex Banney is now in his mid-40s, appearing in court again in 2024 for the brutal murders that he and his friend David Anderson carried out when they were 17. You've been afforded the opportunity for resentencing in this case. The 2012 Supreme Court ruling in Miller v. Alabama determined juveniles cannot be sentenced to life in prison without parole. That ruling meant a judge would have to resentence Banney for the murders of the Wilson family. This case really is an outlier. This is not the typical juvenile offense that you see. Banney and Anderson killed their former classmate Kim Wilson at a park, then went to her home to kill her parents Bill and Rose and her sister Julie. As for motive, prosecutors said Banney had a fascination with violence. During a taped interview, Banney said he wanted to kill someone to experience something, quote, truly phenomenal. As the convicted quadruple murderer left the courtroom, no comment. He simply smiled for the families left behind. It's a cruel echo because the Wilsons don't get that second look. There's no parole for the dead, no sentence reduction for those who were buried in matching caskets: Kim, Julia, Rose, Bill, for names that were erased in a single night of horror. And now the boys responsible for those deaths may one day walk out of their prison cells as the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Nightcare True Crime Stories. Remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep, and until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.